There is a version of the American Southwest that you were never taught, not because it was lost, not because historians forgot to write it down, but because the version that was written down served a purpose, and that purpose was never really about the truth. It was about ownership. It was about who gets to say they built something and who gets erased from the foundation underneath it. The story you were handed in school went something like this. Spanish explorers arrived. They met some native peoples. They built missions. They converted the population. Then, eventually, the Americans came, and that was that. Clean, tidy. A paragraph and a half on your way to the Civil War chapter. But every single layer of that story is either missing something enormous or pointing you deliberately in the wrong direction. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now. Before we go any further, I want you to hold something in your mind. The southwest of North America, the region that would eventually become New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and California, was not empty when Spain arrived. It was not a blank canvas waiting for a more advanced civilization to fill it in. It was home to some of the most sophisticated urban traditions, agricultural systems, astronomical knowledge, and long-distance trade networks on the face of the earth. And those systems had been running, building, collapsing, rebuilding, and evolving for thousands of years before a single Spanish boot touched the Rio Grande. The people who lived there were not primitive. They were not wandering aimlessly through the desert waiting to be civilized. They were engineers, astronomers, farmers, traders, architects, and storytellers, and they had been all of those things for so long that by the time Spain sent its first expedition north from Mexico, the ruins of cities that had been abandoned centuries earlier were already ancient history to the people then living. That is where this story actually begins. Not in 1540 with Francisco Vázquez de Coronado on horseback, squinting at the horizon. Not in 1598 with Juan de Onate planting a cross in the desert sand. It begins thousands of years before any of that, in the slow emergence of one of the most misunderstood civilizations that ever existed on this continent. The people we now call the ancestral Puebloans, though that name itself is a modern compromise, were building multi-story stone architecture, while most of Europe was still constructing in timber and thatch. In the canyon country of what is now the Four Corners region, where the states of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet at a single surveyed point, they carved entire cities into cliff faces, stacked sandstone rooms 12 stories high, and engineered drainage systems that collected and redirected every drop of rain that fell on a mesa top. Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico is perhaps the most extraordinary example, though it is far from the only one. The great houses at Chaco were not villages. They were something far more complicated than that. Pueblo Bonito alone contained more than 800 rooms and rose to 4 stories at its back wall. The construction required hauling more than 200,000 wooden beams from forests that were at least 50 miles away, across terrain where no wheeled transport existed and no draft animals helped with the weight. Every beam, every stone, every jar of mortar was carried by human hands. But the sheer physical labor is not even the most remarkable part. What is remarkable is the precision. The walls of Chaco's great houses were oriented to solar and lunar events with an accuracy that modern archaeologists initially refused to believe. Certain doorways frame the rising sun on the summer solstice. Certain windows align with the position of the moon at its most northerly standstill, an event that repeats only once every 18.6 years. The Great Kiva at Casa Rinconada sits at a latitude and orientation that places its north-facing wall exactly on the cardinal direction, within a fraction of a degree. You do not accomplish that by accident. You accomplish that through generations of observation, through knowledge systems capable of tracking celestial cycles across decades, through an understanding of mathematics and geometry that requires sustained intellectual tradition. The people who built Chaco were doing astronomy. They were encoding that astronomy into their architecture, and they had been doing it long enough that by the time the buildings we can still see today were being constructed, around 900 to 1100 years after the Common Era began. The tradition behind them was already very old. The road system that connected Chaco to the broader regional network is another detail that rarely makes it into casual history. The Chacoans built roads, not trails, not worn pathways, but engineered roads with defined edges, cleared surfaces, and consistent widths of roughly 30 feet. These roads ran in straight lines for miles across the desert landscape, regardless of terrain, climbing over obstacles rather than curving around them. They connected Chaco Canyon to dozens of outlying great houses scattered across a region the size of a modern state. Archaeologists found these roads by accident, mostly in the 1970s, when aerial photography of the region began revealing faint linear patterns in the soil that didn't match any natural feature. When researchers investigated on the ground, they found ancient road surfaces still partially intact beneath centuries of desert dust. And they found something else that puzzled everyone. The roads were wider than they needed to be for foot traffic. In some places, parallel road segments ran side by side. Some roads seemed to lead nowhere obvious, terminating at cliff edges or out in the open desert. This is where the textbook version, if it even mentions Chaco at all, usually stops. It notes the roads, calls them impressive, and moves on. What it does not do is ask what the roads were actually for, who was using them, and what kind of political or ceremonial system required that level of infrastructure investment across a landscape this vast. The answer, as best as archaeologists can reconstruct it, is that Chaco was a center, not a city in the sense of a permanently packed urban settlement, but a ritual and administrative center that drew people, goods, and resources from across a very wide region. The great houses may not have been primarily residential. The number of rooms relative to the number of hearths, cookware, and domestic refuse is strangely low. Some researchers now think that many rooms were for storage, and that the population present at Chaco at any one time was smaller than the architecture would suggest, swelling dramatically during periodic ceremonial gatherings that brought people from hundreds of miles away. Turquoise found at Chaco came from mines near what is now Santa Fe, from deposits in the mountains of what is now Nevada, from sources that required days of travel in every direction. Macaws, tropical parrots from Mesoamerica, were kept at Chaco, their feathers used in ritual practice. Shells from the Pacific coast and the Gulf of Mexico appear in the archaeological record. Cacao, the plant from which chocolate is made, has been found in ceramic residues at Chaco, indicating that processed cacao drinks were being consumed there, a practice otherwise known from Mesoamerican ceremonial contexts. This tells you something that no single textbook chapter on the prehistoric Southwest has ever communicated clearly. Chaco was not isolated. It was not a provincial phenomenon. It was embedded in a trade and communication network that extended from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Great Plains to central Mexico, and that network was carrying not just goods but ideas, rituals, and knowledge across distances that most people today would consider extraordinary even with modern transportation. The collapse of the Chacoan system, sometime in the 12th century, is itself a subject that deserves far more attention than it gets. A prolonged drought, documented in tree ring records from the region, coincides with the period of Chaco's apparent decline. The great houses stopped being built. Populations began dispersing. The road system fell into disuse. But the people did not disappear. This is a crucial point that gets glossed over constantly. The collapse of Chaco was not the end of the ancestral Puebloan tradition. It was a reorganization. The descendants of the Chacoans moved. Some went south along the Rio Grande Valley. Some moved into the upland areas of what is now central and eastern New Mexico. Some went to the Hopi Mesas in what is now northern Arizona, and in those new locations they built again. The villages that would later be called pueblos by the Spanish were not primitive settlements. They were the latest iteration of an architectural and social tradition that was already more than 1,000 years old when Coronado arrived. The Hohokam people of what is now southern Arizona present another layer of this story that gets almost no attention at all. The Hohokam built one of the most extensive canal irrigation systems ever constructed in the pre-industrial world. In the Phoenix Basin alone, they built more than 500 miles of main canals, with a network of smaller distribution channels extending the reach of that water across a desert landscape that receives perhaps 7 inches of rainfall per year. These were not simple ditches. The Hohokam canals were engineered with consistent gradients, calculated to move water efficiently, without either pooling in low spots or moving so quickly that the channel walls eroded. They used no metal tools. They had no surveying instruments in the modern sense, and yet they maintained grade across miles of flat desert with an accuracy that would not look out of place on a modern civil engineering project. At the site of Snaketown, near what is now Phoenix, excavations revealed a settlement that had been continuously occupied for more than 1,000 years. The Hohokam were not nomads who happened to dig some ditches. They were a civilization with an economy built around irrigated agriculture at scale, supporting population densities that the desert would otherwise never have allowed. They also played ball. Platform mounds and ball courts at Hohokam sites connect them clearly to the broader Mesoamerican cultural sphere, suggesting exchange of not just goods, but of specific ceremonial practices with civilizations much farther south. The rubber balls used in the Mesoamerican ball game have been found at Hohokam sites. This is not incidental. Rubber comes from tropical trees that do not grow in Arizona. Someone carried those balls north over enormous distances because the game or its associated ritual context was important enough to justify the effort. The Mogollon people of the mountain country stretching from what is now central New Mexico into southeastern Arizona round out this picture of the pre-contact Southwest as a complex, multi-tradition landscape that had been developing for millennia. The famous Mimbres branch of the Mogollon left behind some of the most extraordinary painted pottery ever produced in North America. Mimbres bowls, produced roughly between 900 and 1100 of the Common Era, are covered with painted scenes that include naturalistic animals, geometric designs of extraordinary complexity, and narrative images that appear to depict specific events, mythological figures, and ceremonial practices. The quality of Mimbres painting is such that when it first came to widespread attention among art collectors in the early 20th century, there was serious debate about whether the pottery could actually be pre-Columbian. The sophistication of the line work, the compositional sense, the humor and life in the animal depictions, these seemed incompatible with the image of primitive prehistory that the Southwest's ancient inhabitants had been assigned in the popular imagination. Most Mimbres bowls were ritually killed, meaning a hole was punched through the bottom before being placed with the dead. This practice connects to belief systems about the movement of the spirit out of physical containers, and it suggests a rich ceremonial life organized around specific ideas about death, continuity, and the relationship between the living and those who had gone before. It is not the material culture of a people waiting around to be discovered. All of this was the world that existed before Spain arrived, not a wilderness, not a void. A populated, organized, historically deep, culturally sophisticated landscape whose peoples had been managing the land, building and abandoning cities, tracking the stars, conducting long-distance trade, and developing complex ceremonial and political systems for so long that the period of Spanish colonization represents only a thin slice of the full story. And yet it is that thin slice, that period of contact and conquest, that dominates the history you were taught, while the thousands of years that came before it get reduced to a vague paragraph about ancient peoples. Why? Because centering the Puebloan past, the Hohokam past, the Mogollon past, the complex and deep indigenous history of the Southwest, would force a very different reading of what Spain actually did when it arrived. If the land was empty, Spain discovered it. If the land was home to scattered, simple, pre-civilized peoples, Spain civilized it. But if the land was home to organized, sophisticated, historically rooted civilizations with their own laws, governance systems, agricultural economies, and knowledge traditions, then what Spain did was something else entirely. And that is a conversation that the textbook version of Southwestern history has never been willing to have, honestly. Let's talk about what Spain was actually looking for when it sent its first expeditions north from New Spain, which was what the Spanish colonial administration called Mexico after the fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521. The answer is gold. That is always the beginning. The fall of the Aztec Empire, which Hernan Cortés engineered through a combination of military violence, manipulation of existing political tensions among the peoples of central Mexico, and the catastrophic arrival of European diseases that killed people faster than any army, had produced an enormous influx of wealth into the Spanish crown's treasury. Silver and gold from Mexico, and later from the silver mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia, were transforming the Spanish Empire into the wealthiest and most powerful state in Europe. That wealth made Spain hungry for more. Every rumor of another rich civilization somewhere to the north was taken seriously, investigated, followed up. The story of the 7 cities of Cibola, which would eventually draw Coronado north in 1540, was built on exactly this kind of rumor. Word had come back from the failed Narvaez expedition through the extraordinary account of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca that there were cities somewhere to the north, cities of great wealth and sophistication. Cabeza de Vaca had spent 8 years wandering across the southern half of the continent after the Narvaez expedition dissolved into disaster on the Gulf Coast of Florida in 1528. He and 3 companions, including the African slave Estevanico, had walked from the coast of Texas to the Pacific coast of Mexico, passing through dozens of indigenous communities, learning languages, serving as healers, and gathering information about the landscape to the north. What Cabeza de Vaca actually reported was nuanced. He described large, well-organized settlements. He described people who lived in permanent structures and practiced agriculture. He did not actually claim to have seen cities of gold, but by the time his account was filtered through the ambitions and expectations of colonial administrators in Mexico City, what came out the other side was a story about fabulous wealth, about 7 cities whose streets might literally be paved with turquoise and gold, about a northern kingdom that could rival Mexico in its riches. Estevanico was sent north first, as a scout, in 1539, traveling ahead of a small expedition led by the Franciscan friar Marcos de Niza. Estevanico reached the Zuni pueblos of what is now western New Mexico, where he was killed. The exact circumstances of his death have been debated for centuries. What is not debated is that he saw actual pueblos, actual multi-story stone architecture, actual organized communities with social structure and governance. What Marcos de Niza reported when he came back was a distorted version of this reality, exaggerated in the direction of what his audience wanted to hear. He described seeing, from a distance, a city larger than Mexico City, shining and magnificent. He almost certainly did not see anything of the kind. The Zuni pueblos, impressive and substantial as they were not Mexico City. But the report was enough. Coronado was dispatched in 1540 with an army of more than 300 Spanish soldiers and nearly 1,000 indigenous allies from New Spain, plus a vast train of horses, cattle, sheep, and pigs. He marched north expecting to find a second Aztec empire to conquer and plunder. What he found was something very different, and his reaction to the difference tells you almost everything you need to know about the Spanish colonial project in the southwest. When Coronado's forces arrived at the Zuni pueblo of Hawiku in the summer of 1540, they found a substantial stone village occupied by people who had absolutely no interest in surrendering it. The Zuni defenders positioned themselves on the walls of the pueblo and threw stones and shot arrows at the approaching army. Coronado's forces attacked immediately. The battle was brief. The superior weapons of the Spanish, armor and crossbows and firearms, overwhelmed the defenders quickly, and Coronado took the pueblo by force. Inside he found food, clothing, turquoise, and everyday domestic goods. He found none of the gold and silver that the rumors had promised. His letter back to the viceroy in Mexico City is almost plaintive in its disappointment. He wrote that Marcos de Niza had not told the truth in anything he had reported, because everything was the opposite of what he had said, except the name of the cities and the large stone houses. Coronado spent 2 years traveling across the southwest and into the southern plains of what is now Kansas, searching for the golden cities of Quivira that yet another guide, a Pawnee man the Spanish called the Turk, had promised him. He found grasshouse villages of plains people who lived by following the bison. He found the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, which were real and substantial, but which contained no extractable mineral wealth. He turned around and went home in 1542, reporting to the viceroy that the expedition had been a failure. But failure to find gold did not mean failure in a deeper strategic sense. Coronado's expedition had done something that would have enormous consequences, even though it produced no immediate financial return. It had mapped the northern frontier. It had identified the indigenous communities that lived there, their locations, their strengths, their vulnerabilities. It had opened a path that others would follow, and it had committed at least one atrocity of such scale and deliberateness that it requires careful examination, because it appears in almost no textbook account of Coronado's expedition despite being one of the best documented events of the entire 2-year journey. At the Tiwa-speaking pueblo of Arenal, on the Rio Grande south of what is now Albuquerque, a dispute between Coronado's forces and the local population over the seizure of food, clothing, and housing escalated into an armed conflict. The Spanish response was decisive and horrifying. Coronado ordered the pueblo burned. Defenders and civilians who attempted to flee the burning buildings were killed. Those who surrendered were burned at the stake. Contemporary Spanish accounts, written by participants in the expedition, describe somewhere between 100 and 200 people dying this way. This happened not because the people of Arenal had launched an unprovoked attack. It happened because they resisted having their food seized, their housing requisitioned, and in at least some accounts, their women assaulted by soldiers. They resisted what was happening to them, and the Spanish military response to that resistance was mass execution. This is not ancient rumor. This is documented in the journals and letters of people who were there, and yet it appears in almost no account of Coronado's expedition that is written for general American audiences, because including it would complicate the story of Spanish exploration as an adventure of discovery, rather than what it actually was, which was a military invasion. The 50-year gap between Coronado's return in 1542 and the formal colonization of New Mexico in 1598 is usually treated in textbook accounts as simply empty time, a period of waiting. That framing is wrong in several important ways. First, in that gap, the Spanish conducted numerous other expeditions into the southwest that are rarely mentioned. Antonio de Espejo traveled north in 1582. Francisco Leiva de Bonilla and Antonio Gutierrez de Humana launched an unauthorized expedition into the plains in the late 1580s, and both died there. The region was not forgotten. It was being evaluated, assessed, contested. Second, in that same gap, the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley were undergoing their own changes and dealing with their own internal dynamics, completely independent of what Spain was planning. The Spanish absence did not mean the region was static. Populations shifted. Alliances changed. New communities formed. Old ones contracted. The people of the Southwest were living their own history, not simply waiting for the colonizers to return. And third, the conditions under which colonization eventually happened in 1598 were shaped by decisions made in Spain and in Mexico City that had nothing to do with the Southwest itself and everything to do with imperial competition. England was becoming a threat. Francis Drake had raided Spanish shipping in the Pacific. The idea of a northern land route, a secure corridor of Spanish territory connecting New Spain to the Pacific coast and the Silver Routes, was gaining strategic importance. New Mexico, as the Spanish called the region, was less about local wealth and more about securing a territorial claim against other European powers. Juan de Ornate was the man Spain selected to establish this claim. He was a wealthy silver miner from Zacatecas, the son of a conquistador, and the son-in-law of a granddaughter of Hernan Cortés. He financed the colonization expedition largely himself, bringing approximately 500 people north in 1598, including soldiers, their families, Franciscan missionaries, and enslaved indigenous servants. He came not as an explorer or an administrator trying to build something. He came as a conquistador in the tradition of Cortés and Pizarro, expecting to impose Spanish authority on a population he had no interest in understanding. The early months of Onate's colony were marked by immediate conflict over resources. The Spanish established their first capital at a pueblo they called San Juan de los Caballeros, which was an existing Tewa-speaking pueblo whose inhabitants were essentially displaced to make room for the colonizers. This was the pattern everywhere the Spanish settled. They did not build new towns in empty land. They moved into existing towns, claimed the housing, demanded the food stores, and assigned the population to labor under the system of encomienda, which was the Spanish colonial institution by which indigenous people were required to provide labor and tribute to Spanish landholders in exchange for Christian instruction and protection. Protection that in practice was rarely provided, and more often was protection from the very men providing it. The encomienda system in New Mexico operated on populations that were already under severe stress. The Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley in 1598 had been dealing with drought cycles, with competition from the newly horse-mounted Apache and Navajo peoples to their east and northwest, and with whatever internal political tensions existed within and between their own communities. Adding a colonial administration that demanded tribute in food and labor to an already strained population was not the beginning of something new. It was weight added to a structure already showing cracks. The event that crystallizes what Spanish colonialism in New Mexico actually looked like, and that is simultaneously one of the best documented and most consistently undertaught episodes in early American history, occurred at Acoma Pueblo in December of 1598 and January of 1599. Acoma is a mesa-top pueblo in what is now western New Mexico, built on a sandstone bluff that rises more than 300 feet above the surrounding desert. It had been inhabited continuously for at least 1,000 years by the time of the Spanish arrival, making it one of the oldest continuously occupied settlements in North America. A party of Spanish soldiers under Onate's nephew, Juan de Zaldivar, arrived at Acoma in December 1598, demanding food. The people of Acoma were not inclined to hand over their winter stores to armed strangers with no particular right to demand them. In the confrontation that followed, Zaldivar and approximately 12 other soldiers were killed. What happened next was not law enforcement. What happened next was a military operation designed to send a message. Onate dispatched a punitive expedition under Zaldivar's brother, Vicente, with orders to destroy Acoma. The battle lasted 3 days. The Spanish used a cannon hauled up onto the mesa, which was something the Acoma defenders had no way to counter. When it was over, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 people were dead. The exact number has been debated, but no serious historian disputes that the death toll was enormous relative to the size of the community. What happened to the survivors is where the account gets particularly important and particularly absent from standard textbook treatments. Onate conducted a formal trial. The people of Acoma were found guilty of rebellion against the crown, which was a remarkable legal framing given that the crown had never asked them or informed them that they were subjects of it before demanding their food at gunpoint. And then Onate issued a formal sentence. Adult men over 25 years of age had 1 foot amputated and were sentenced to 20 years of personal servitude. Adult men between 12 and 25 years of age were sentenced to 20 years of personal servitude without amputation. Women over 12 years of age were sentenced to 20 years of personal servitude. Children under 12 were divided between the missionaries and the soldiers for servitude and so-called Christian education. 2 Hopi men who happened to be present at Acoma during the battle had their right hands cut off and were sent back to their own communities as a warning. This judgment was carried out. These things actually happened. They are in the Spanish colonial records, And this is the founding document, in a very real sense, of Spanish authority in the Southwest. Not the planting of a cross, not a peace treaty, not an agricultural demonstration, a mass amputation and a sentence of generational enslavement issued in the name of God and the King of Spain against people who had been defending their food and their homes from an uninvited armed party. Onate was eventually recalled to Mexico City and tried for his conduct in New Mexico. He was convicted of cruelty, including the events at Acoma. He was stripped of his title and exiled from New Mexico. But the colony he established continued. The system he had set in motion continued. The Franciscan missions began spreading across the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, and the structure of colonial exploitation he had imposed became the template for the next 8 decades. The mission system deserves particular examination because it is almost universally presented in textbook accounts as a benevolent enterprise. The missions, in this telling, were places where indigenous peoples were welcomed, protected, fed, educated, and introduced to Christianity. The framing tends to be one of paternalistic generosity, of wise and dedicated priests bringing light to people who lacked it. The actual experience of mission life for indigenous Pueblo people in 17th century New Mexico was nothing like this description. The missions were built through indigenous labor, specifically through the system of mita, or labor draft, which required each Pueblo community to provide a certain number of workers for construction and agricultural projects. The workers were not paid. They were not volunteers. They were conscripted. The construction of a single large mission church could require years of labor from a community that was simultaneously required to maintain its own agriculture and fulfill the tribute demands of the civil colonial administration. The two arms of Spanish colonial authority in New Mexico, the church and the civil government, were in constant conflict with each other throughout the 17th century, and that conflict was not primarily about the welfare of the indigenous population. It was about who got to control Pueblo labor and tribute. The governors and the Franciscan missionaries competed for access to the same scarce resources, and the Pueblo people were caught in the middle of an institutional struggle that treated them as assets to be managed rather than human beings with interests of their own. Conversion was not optional. Participating in traditional Pueblo religious ceremonies was prohibited. The Kachina dances, the ceremonies associated with the kiva, the entire complex of ritual practice that organized Pueblo social and spiritual life, were declared demonic by the missionaries and actively suppressed. In 1661, Governor López de Mendizábal, in an unusual move of relative tolerance, permitted some traditional dances, which immediately provoked fury from the Franciscans. In 1675, the colonial administration conducted a coordinated sweep of Pueblo communities, arresting 47 religious leaders. 3 were hanged, 1 killed himself. The remaining 43 were publicly flogged and sentenced to servitude. This event, the 1,675 persecution of Pueblo religious leaders, is one of the most important and least discussed episodes in southwestern history. It is important not only because of what it was, which was a brutal suppression of indigenous religious practice, but because of what it provoked. Among the men who were flogged and enslaved in 1675 was a religious leader from the Tiwa-speaking pueblo of Oque Owinge, north of what is now Santa Fe. His name was Pope, and 5 years later, Pope would organize and lead the only fully successful indigenous revolt against European colonialism in the history of North America. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is perhaps the most consequential event in the history of the American Southwest. And it is perhaps the event that the textbook version of that history is most determined to minimize, neutralize, or simply omit. Because what the Pueblo Revolt demonstrates, beyond any possibility of alternative interpretation, is that the Spanish colonial project in New Mexico was not welcomed, was not tolerated, was not accepted by the people it was imposed upon. It was endured, under conditions of extreme coercion, until the moment when a coordinated resistance became possible, and then it was decisively rejected. Pope spent the years between 1675 and 1680 traveling among the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley, building a coalition. This was extraordinarily difficult work. The Pueblo communities spoke multiple, mutually unintelligible languages: Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, Zuni, Hopi, Keres. These were not dialects of a single tongue, but genuinely distinct languages that had developed independently over centuries. The communities had their own internal politics, their own rivalries, their own varying experiences of colonial administration. Getting them to act together, in secret, against a common enemy with superior weapons required remarkable organizational skill. Pope coordinated the revolt to begin on the 11th of August 1680, sending runners to each participating pueblo with knotted cords, one knot to be untied each day, marking the countdown to the uprising. When 2 runners were captured by the Spanish and the plan was revealed, Pope moved the date up by 1 day, launching the revolt on August 10. The speed and coordination of what followed still impresses historians who study it. Within days, the Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley had killed approximately 400 Spanish colonists and 21 of the 33 Franciscan priests serving in the region. The survivors, about 2,500 people, fled south in a desperate retreat down the Rio Grande, pursued but not caught, eventually reaching El Paso del Norte, where they established a refugee settlement. Spain had been expelled from New Mexico completely. Every Spanish colonist, every priest, every soldier, every administrator was gone. The colony that had taken 82 years to establish had been dismantled in a matter of days. This had never happened anywhere else in the Spanish colonial world. It would not happen again. Pope ordered the destruction of the physical evidence of Spanish colonialism. Churches were torn down or converted to kivas. Spanish livestock was either killed or redistributed. The Spanish language was to be abandoned. Christian names were to be abandoned. The traditional ceremonies that had been suppressed for decades could now be performed openly again. The world, as much as possible, was to be returned to what it had been before 1598. Pope's governance of the post-revolt coalition was complicated and not without its own difficulties. He was accused by some communities of arrogance and of behaviors that mirrored the colonial domination he had expelled. He died around 1688 before the Spanish returned. But his achievement, the successful coordination of a multi-language, multi-community uprising that drove out an entrenched colonial power and recovered indigenous sovereignty over the landscape, stands as one of the most remarkable political and military accomplishments in the history of this continent, and it appears in most American history curricula as a footnote, if it appears at all. Spain did return. Between 1681 and 1692, the Spanish made several attempts to reconquer New Mexico that failed. In 1692, Don Diego de Vargas led a military expedition that managed to secure formal submissions from a number of Pueblo communities, which the Spanish described as a peaceful reconquest, and which Pueblo oral tradition describes very differently, as a coerced acknowledgement made under the threat of military force. In 1693 and 1694, actual military operations were required to take several communities by force. The reconquest was neither peaceful nor swift. It took years, and it left the relationship between the Spanish colonial administration and the Pueblo communities permanently altered. After 1692, the Spanish never again tried to suppress Pueblo religion as completely as they had before 1680. The Kachina dances continued, the kivas were maintained, the ceremonial calendar was kept, the missionaries were present, but their authority over Pueblo internal life was substantially curtailed. This was not generosity. This was pragmatism born of the knowledge that the alternative was another revolt, and that the next revolt might not leave any survivors to reconstitute the colony. The post-revolt accommodation between Spain and the Pueblo communities is one of the most interesting and least taught aspects of the entire Southwest colonial period. It produced a hybrid social reality that was neither purely Spanish nor purely Pueblo, but something genuinely in between, a negotiated coexistence built on the memory of violence on both sides. Pueblo people participated in the colonial economy, supplied labor and tribute, served in Spanish military expeditions against other indigenous peoples. The Spanish administered the civil and ecclesiastical structure of the colony, and underneath all of it, Pueblo ceremonial and social life continued, carefully, persistently, insistently. That insistence is itself a story. The survival of Pueblo cultural continuity across 3.5 centuries of colonial and then American rule. The preservation of languages, ceremonies, architectural traditions, agricultural practices, and community governance systems that trace their roots back 1,000 years before any European arrived, is one of the genuine historical achievements of any people anywhere. It does not get told as an achievement. It barely gets told at all, but it is there, persistent and remarkable, if you know where to look. Now let's talk about the Texas frontier, because the story of Spanish colonialism in the Southwest was never limited to New Mexico alone, and the Texas experience adds dimensions to this history that are almost completely absent from standard accounts. Spain's interest in what is now Texas developed slowly and was driven initially not by any enthusiasm for the land itself, but by anxiety about French encroachment. When the French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, established a short-lived colony near Matagorda Bay on the Texas Gulf Coast in 1685, Spain responded with alarm. The interior of the continent between New Spain and the French settlements to the north and east was suddenly contested territory in a way it had not been before. Spain needed to establish a presence in Texas, not to exploit it, but to block someone else from doing so. The result was a series of missions established in East Texas starting in the early 1690s, designed to create a chain of Spanish outposts that would assert territorial claim and bring the indigenous peoples of the region under Spanish religious and civil authority. The missions in East Texas were chronically underfunded, undersupplied, and persistently hostile to the interests of the people they were nominally serving. They were also established in the middle of a landscape that already had its own complex political ecology, and the Spanish understanding of that ecology was minimal. The Caddo people of East Texas were not an undifferentiated tribal mass. They were a confederation of distinct communities with sophisticated agricultural practices, permanent villages, extensive trade relationships with peoples across the southern plains and the lower Mississippi Valley, and a ceremonial and political tradition organized around the authority of chiefs called Cadi and a ceremonial figure called the Zinisi. They had been dealing with European trade goods and the ripple effects of European diseases long before any Spanish colonist reached their territory. They were not newcomers to the complexities of navigating relationships with outsiders. When the Spanish arrived and began establishing missions, the Caddo were initially willing to engage. They had seen trade goods, and they had heard about the epidemic diseases that followed European contact. They understood, at least partially, that the relationship required careful management. What they were not willing to do was abandon their own social and religious structures in favor of the version of Christian civilization the missionaries were offering. The missions in East Texas repeatedly failed to attract or retain indigenous converts, not because the Caddo were obstinate, but because the missionaries were asking them to give up things that were central to their identity and social organization, and offering in return very little that compensated for that loss. The diseases did not need the missions to travel. Epidemic after epidemic moved through the Caddo communities during the 17th and 18th centuries. The population of the Caddo Confederacy, estimated at somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 people at the time of the first sustained European contact, collapsed catastrophically. By 1800, fewer than 10,000 Caddo people survived. This demographic collapse, driven primarily by introduced diseases but accelerated by the disruption of social systems, access to food, and traditional healing practices that colonial administration produced, is the single most important fact about Spanish Texas, and it appears in almost no account of the period. The Spanish mission system in Texas expanded during the 18th century, with the most famous cluster of missions established at San Antonio de Bexar after 1718. The San Antonio missions, 5 of which survive in various states of preservation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, are today presented to tourists as architectural achievements and as evidence of Spanish benevolence toward indigenous peoples. The National Park Service interpretive materials at the missions are better than most at acknowledging the complex realities of mission life, but the general popular understanding remains dominated by the romantic image of the mission as a sanctuary. The missions at San Antonio were built to serve the Coahuiltecan-speaking peoples of the South Texas brush country, a diverse group of small hunter-gatherer bands who had been devastated by epidemic disease and by the expansion of Apache raiding from the north. They came to the missions in part because their traditional way of life had been made untenable by disease, by the disruption of their social systems, and by the increasing hostility of the landscape around them. This is not the story of people freely choosing civilization. It is the story of people whose options had been progressively eliminated, who chose what seemed like survival from among what remained available. Mission life meant labor. It meant the European agricultural calendar imposed on people whose food traditions were organized around mobility and seasonal resource exploitation. It meant restrictions on movement, on marriage choices, on ceremonial practice. It meant corporal punishment for infractions of mission rules, which were enforced by soldiers stationed at the presidio associated with each mission. The missionaries were not cruel men in any personal sense, for the most part, but the system they administered was coercive by design, and the people subject to it experienced it as coercive. The mortality rates inside the missions were consistently higher than the birth rates. The population of each mission declined steadily over time rather than growing. This is a pattern that holds true across the entire mission system in the Southwest, in Texas, in Arizona, and in California, and it tells you something important. People were not thriving in the missions. The missions were not environments that supported human health and reproduction. They were environments of chronic stress, nutritional transition, exposure to respiratory diseases in close quarters, and social disruption, and their populations declined accordingly. Let's shift now to the Sonoran Desert frontier, what is now southern Arizona, where the Jesuit priest Eusebio Francisco Kino established a mission system among the O'odham people beginning in 1687, and where a different version of the Spanish colonial story unfolded with its own distinct characteristics. Kino was, by any measure, an extraordinary individual. He was a skilled cartographer, a mathematician, and a genuinely devoted missionary who learned O'odham and spent 3 decades on the frontier, making more than 50 major journeys through what is now southern Arizona and Sonora. His missions at places like Tumacacori and San Xavier del Bac introduced cattle and horses and wheat to the O'odham, and the material exchange had some genuine utility for communities that were under pressure from Apache raiding. But the Kino mission system also embedded the O'odham in a colonial structure that would eventually become the basis for their dispossession. And the moment when that dispossession became acute came in 1751, with an event called the Pima Revolt. The Jesuit missions in the Pimeria Alta, as the Spanish called the region, had been managed by a small number of missionaries spread across a vast territory. The civil colonial administration, soldiers and administrators based in presidios, interacted with the indigenous population in ways that the missionaries often objected to, but could not prevent. Sexual violence against indigenous women by soldiers was documented and complained about repeatedly in the mission records. Labor demands escalated. The O'odham communities were increasingly required to serve the colonial economy rather than their own. Luis Opicajigua, a man the Spanish had trusted enough to appoint as Captain General of the Pima, organized a coordinated uprising in November 1751. The revolt spread quickly across the mission communities. More than 100 Spanish colonists and 2 missionaries were killed. The Spanish military response was rapid and overwhelming. The revolt was suppressed within months. Luis was captured, tried, and eventually pardoned, which was unusual enough to suggest that the Spanish recognized, even if they did not say so publicly, that the conditions that had produced the revolt were not entirely the fault of the people who had revolted. The aftermath of the 1751 revolt produced a formal reorganization of the colonial administration in southern Arizona, including the establishment of a presidio at Tubac in 1752, but it did not fundamentally change the conditions that had caused the revolt. The O'odham remained subject to the demands of the colonial system, the violence continued, and the landscape continued to be shaped by forces that had nothing to do with the wishes or interests of the people who had lived there for thousands of years. The shift from Jesuit to Franciscan administration of the missions in 1767, when King Carlos III expelled the Jesuits from all Spanish territories, added another layer of disruption. The Franciscans who replaced the Jesuits had different priorities, different relationships with the civil administration, and in some cases very different levels of engagement with the indigenous communities they inherited. The transition was disruptive in ways that are almost never discussed in standard accounts, which tend to treat the missions as a continuous, benevolent institution rather than as an institution that itself went through major structural changes driven by European ecclesiastical politics that had nothing to do with the Southwest at all. Now let's talk about horses, because the introduction of the horse to the indigenous peoples of the Southwest and Great Plains is one of the most consequential and least honestly discussed events in the history of North America. The standard account presents the diffusion of horses from the Spanish as an incidental byproduct of colonial contact, as if horses simply wandered away from Spanish ranches and happened to be adopted by indigenous peoples who happened to find them useful. The actual story is more interesting and more complicated. Horses reached the indigenous peoples of the Southwest through multiple channels. Some were captured from Spanish ranchers and military expeditions. Some were traded. Some escaped. But the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was a critical turning point in this process, because when the Spanish fled south in 1680, they left behind enormous numbers of horses, cattle, and sheep that were then distributed among the Pueblo communities and traded outward to other peoples. The revolt, in other words, accelerated the diffusion of horses into indigenous North America by decades. The communities that most dramatically transformed their way of life around the horse were the peoples of the southern plains, particularly the Comanche, who migrated from the Great Basin into the southern plains in the early 18th century and who developed an equestrian culture of extraordinary effectiveness in a remarkably short time. Within a generation or two of acquiring horses in significant numbers, the Comanche had become the dominant military power on the southern plains, capable of ranging across an area the size of several European countries, raiding Spanish settlements in Texas and New Mexico with near impunity, trading across an enormous network, and building a political economy built on the horse, the bison, and the control of trade routes. The rise of Comanche power is one of the great undertold stories of the 18th century Southwest, and it is undertold precisely because it disrupts the standard narrative of Spanish colonial dominance. Spain did not control the southern plains during the 18th century. The Comanche did. The Spanish settlements in Texas existed in large measure because the Comanche permitted them to exist, not because Spain had the military capacity to defend them from a determined Comanche assault. Comanche raids on the mission settlements and ranches of Texas were not sporadic violence by primitive peoples who did not understand what they were doing. They were calculated military and economic operations conducted by a sophisticated political actor that understood the Spanish colonial system well, knew its weaknesses, and exploited them consistently and deliberately. The Comanche extracted tribute from the Spanish in the form of trade goods, horses, and weapons, using the threat of raiding to compel what diplomacy and trade alone might not have produced. In 1786, after decades of conflict, the Spanish and the Comanche reached a formal peace agreement, the Treaty of 1786, brokered by the governor of New Mexico, Juan Bautista de Anza. This treaty is almost never discussed in standard accounts of the period. It is important because it represents Spain explicitly acknowledging that it could not defeat the Comanche militarily, and needed to negotiate. The treaty involved Spain providing the Comanche with trade goods, including firearms, in exchange for peace on the frontier. Spain, in other words, was paying protection money to the indigenous power that controlled the region. This is not the story of Spanish colonial domination. This is the story of Spanish colonial limitation, of the actual constraints on what a colonial system could and could not do when it encountered a fully capable and strategically sophisticated indigenous military power. The Apache deserve equal attention in this story, though their relationship with the Spanish colonial system was different from the Comanche and no less significant. The Apache peoples, who had been expanding southward and eastward from their original territories in what is now eastern Arizona and western New Mexico during the 17th century, were in consistent conflict with both the Spanish colonial settlements and the Pueblo communities throughout the colonial period. The standard account of Apache-Spanish conflict tends to frame the Apache as raiders, as the source of instability and violence on the frontier, as the problem that the colonial system was trying to manage. This framing inverts the actual causal structure. The Apache were not raiding the Spanish because they were innately violent or because they had no other options. They were raiding the Spanish because the Spanish colonial economy had disrupted the resource base that the Apache had previously depended on, because the expansion of Spanish ranching into territory the Apache had used for hunting was eliminating game animals, and because the Spanish themselves had forcibly displaced Apache communities from their territory in the process of establishing colonial settlement. The most sustained Spanish military campaign against the Apache in the 18th century involved a combination of direct military operations, the resettlement of Apache communities in what were called establecimientos de paz, or peace establishments, and the deliberate use of trade goods, particularly alcohol, to create dependencies that would make the Apache less effective as a military force. This last strategy, the deliberate use of trade in alcohol as a tool of colonial pacification, is documented in the Spanish military records of the period. It was not accidental, it was policy. The establecimientos de paz did succeed in reducing Apache raiding on the New Mexico and Texas frontiers during the late 18th century, at the cost of creating large dependent communities of Apache people who had been maneuvered into a position where raiding was no longer viable and where the alternative was relying on Spanish trade goods and food distributions. When those distributions were cut off by the disruptions of the late colonial period, the Apache who had been settled in this way found themselves in a desperate situation, without the territorial base that had supported their previous way of life, and without the colonial support they had come to depend on. All of this happened before a single American soldier crossed the Rio Grande. All of this shaped the landscape that the United States acquired after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. The Southwest that became American territory in 1848 was not a blank slate. It was a territory with 3 centuries of specific history, with indigenous communities that had survived, adapted to, resisted, and in some cases negotiated accommodations with Spanish and then Mexican colonialism. And the United States inherited that history whether it chose to acknowledge it or not. The American historical narrative, largely, chose not to. The Mexican period between 1821 and 1848 is another layer of this story that receives almost no attention. When Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821, the southwestern territories became part of the New Mexican Republic. The shift of sovereignty did not dramatically change the material conditions of life for the indigenous peoples of the region, but it changed the legal framework and it changed the aspirations and capacity of the colonial administration. Mexico attempted to implement land reforms, secularize the missions, and integrate the indigenous population into a theoretically equal citizenship. The attempt was only partially successful and was often undermined by local power structures that had no interest in genuine equality. The secularization of the California missions, which happened in stages during the 1830s, is a case study in what happened when a system designed around coerced indigenous labor was nominally dismantled. The intention was to convert the mission lands into indigenous homesteads and ranches, distributing the property that had been accumulated through generations of forced indigenous labor to the people who had produced it. What actually happened was that local Mexican landowners, the rancho class that was consolidating economic power in California during this period, maneuvered to acquire most of the mission land, and the indigenous people who had labored on it found themselves without the communal structure that had organized their lives and without land of their own. The transition from the mission system to the rancho economy involved no improvement in the actual conditions of indigenous life. The labor demands continued, the dispossession continued. The population continued to decline from disease. By the time the United States acquired California in 1848, and the gold rush of 1849 brought 100,000 migrants into the territory within a single year, the indigenous population of California had already been reduced by the Spanish and then Mexican colonial period to perhaps 150,000 people, from what had been a pre-contact population estimated at somewhere between 300,000 and 1 million. What the gold rush and early American period did to that surviving population is a story that belongs to a different chapter. But it is important to note here that the conditions that made it possible, the infrastructure of dispossession, the patterns of treating indigenous life as disposable, the legal frameworks that denied indigenous people any effective rights against colonial appropriation, all of these were inherited directly from the Spanish and Mexican colonial period. The United States did not invent the destruction of indigenous California. It accelerated and completed it. Let's return now to New Mexico and follow the thread of what happened between the reconquest of 1692 and the American acquisition of 1848, because this is the period that most deeply shaped the political and social reality that the United States inherited, and it is the period most completely absent from textbook accounts. The 18th century in New Mexico was characterized by a persistent, grinding conflict between the Spanish colonial settlements and the Apache and Navajo communities to the east and northwest, punctuated by periodic raids and retaliatory expeditions that neither side could permanently resolve. The colonial settlements along the Rio Grande were confined to a relatively narrow corridor, unable to expand significantly in any direction without immediately entering territory that was either actively hostile or too arid for the agricultural economy the colonists depended on. The Navajo people in particular represent a case study in the complexity of this history. The Navajo, whose own origins as a distinct people are a subject of scholarly debate, were in this period developing the sheep herding and weaving economy that would become the foundation of their culture and eventually one of the most recognizable artistic traditions in North America. Navajo weaving, which appears in its distinctive patterns by the 18th century, incorporated dyes and wool from the Spanish-introduced sheep into a tradition of textile production that drew on much older techniques and designs. This is cultural synthesis at its most creative, an indigenous people taking elements introduced by colonialism and transforming them into something genuinely original. At the same time, the Navajo were conducting regular raids on the Spanish settlements and being raided in return, participating in a captive economy that moved people of various origins across the Southwest as enslaved laborers. Navajo people captured by the Spanish ended up as servants in the households of Santa Fe. Spanish and Pueblo people captured by the Navajo were incorporated into Navajo communities, sometimes eventually becoming Navajo themselves through the kind of cultural adoption that the Navajo practiced for those willing to integrate. The boundaries between these communities were porous in ways that the standard historical narrative, which tends to treat them as completely separate groups in perpetual opposition, never captures. The captive trade is itself a history that has been systematically obscured. Slavery in the Southwest predated Spanish arrival and continued throughout the colonial period and into the American period. The Spanish colonial system used enslaved indigenous labor not only through the formal encomienda structure, but through a direct market in human beings. Apache and Navajo captives were bought and sold in the markets of Santa Fe and Taos. Pueblo people sometimes sold captives from other communities to the Spanish to reduce their own tribute burdens. Spanish soldiers on military expeditions took captives as a personal financial benefit of service on the frontier. The word Genizaro, which describes the class of enslaved or formerly enslaved indigenous people who were incorporated into the Spanish colonial economy, is another term that appears in no standard textbook account. Genizaros were people of various indigenous origins who had been taken from their home communities, usually as children, and raised in Spanish households or missions. They occupied a specific and explicitly second-class position in colonial society. They were nominally Christian, nominally Spanish-speaking, nominally participants in the colonial world, but without the land rights, the civic status, or the social recognition that the Spanish settlers enjoyed. By the late 18th century, Genizaros made up a significant fraction of the population of New Mexico, perhaps as much as a third in some estimates, and they were settled in their own communities on the frontier, where they served as a buffer population between the Spanish settlements and the unconquered peoples beyond. Towns like Abiquiu, Belen, and Tome were founded largely by Genizaro communities who had been given land on the most exposed frontier positions in exchange for the military service of defending the edge of the colonial territory. This is not a minor footnote. This is a major dimension of who built the Southwest and whose labor and sacrifice created the infrastructure of the colonial economy, and is almost completely absent from standard accounts. The political crisis of the late colonial period, the disruptions produced by the Napoleonic invasion of Spain in 1807, and the subsequent collapse of Spanish royal authority hit New Mexico in ways that are similarly under-discussed. The colony had always been a marginal enterprise from Spain's financial perspective. It produced no mineral wealth. It generated no significant tax revenue. It existed primarily as a territorial claim and a missionary enterprise, and the resources devoted to maintaining it had always been inadequate to the task. When the revenues from Spain dried up during the Napoleonic period, the colonial administration in New Mexico was essentially on its own. The soldiers went unpaid. The missions lost what minimal support they received from the central administration. The Genizaro frontier communities were expected to defend themselves with minimal support from the government that had placed them there. The result was not immediate collapse, but a gradual fraying of the colonial infrastructure that was well underway by the time Mexico achieved independence in 1821. The Mexican period brought new complications. The legal framework changed, but the social and economic realities changed more slowly. The land grant system, by which the Spanish crown had distributed rights to specific tracts of land, became both a source of continuing stability for those who held grants and a source of ongoing conflict as the boundaries of grants were contested. Overlapping claims emerged, and the transition to Mexican law created ambiguities about which grants were still valid and under what conditions. The community land grants, which gave shared access rights to land to entire communities rather than to individual owners, were a particularly significant institution in this regard. Under the Spanish and early Mexican systems, many Pueblo communities held formal land grants that guaranteed their access to the land they had occupied for generations. These grants were legally recognized under Spanish law, under Mexican law, and were nominally guaranteed by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, when the United States acquired the Southwest. What actually happened to those grants in the American period is one of the most important and most consistently undertold stories in American legal history. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848, promised that the property rights of Mexican citizens in the ceded territory, which included not just individual land grants but the community land grants of the Pueblo peoples, would be fully respected under American law. This was a specific, clear, legally binding promise. It was not kept. The legal process by which Spanish and Mexican land grants were reviewed and confirmed in the American period was the Surveyor General system, established by Congress in 1854, and later the Court of Private Land Claims established in 1891. These processes were designed, in theory, to adjudicate which grants were valid and should be confirmed. In practice, they confirmed far less than they should have, denied far more, and produced an outcome in which enormous portions of land that had been held under valid Spanish and Mexican grants ended up in the hands of Anglo-American landholders or in the public domain. The legal mechanisms used to accomplish this dispossession were subtle enough that they did not require explicit violations of the treaty's text. They required interpreting the treaty narrowly, imposing documentary requirements that applicants could not always meet because Spanish colonial record-keeping had been inconsistent, applying American property law concepts that did not translate cleanly onto the Spanish land grant system, and in some cases, simply waiting out claimants until the expense and delay of the confirmation process made it cheaper to sell or abandon the claim than to continue pursuing it. The Maxwell Land Grant in northeastern New Mexico is one of the most dramatic examples of this process, involving a tract of land that eventually grew, through legal manipulation and the addition of dubious acreage to an existing grant, to approximately 1.7 million acres, the largest land grant ever confirmed by the United States court system. The way that grant grew from its original legitimate acreage to its final enormous extent involves a level of legal creativity and political manipulation that, if it had been employed to take land from Anglo-American settlers rather than from Hispanic and Indigenous communities, would have been recognized immediately as fraud. But the most persistent and systematic dispossession in the American Southwest happened not through the courts but through the Homestead Acts, through the establishment of the national forests, and through the administrative decisions about the boundaries of Indian reservations. And this process continued not through the 19th century only, but well into the 20th. Communities that had held land under Spanish grants for 3 or 4 generations found those grants reduced, invalidated, or converted into reservation land that came with a different and more restricted set of legal rights than the original grant had provided. The Pueblo people of New Mexico faced an additional complication in the American period. Because the Spanish colonial system had treated the Pueblo as nominally Christian and nominally integrated into the colonial structure, their legal status under American law was ambiguous in ways that the legal status of other indigenous peoples was not. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1887 and subsequent legislation assumed a sharp distinction between tribal peoples and citizens, but the Pueblo communities did not fit neatly into either category as American law defined them. This ambiguity was exploited. A Supreme Court decision in 1876 held that the Pueblo were not Indians in the legal sense that entitled them to the protections of federal Indian law, which meant that their lands could be sold and alienated just like any other private property. This resulted in decades during which individual Pueblo landholdings were sold, sometimes fraudulently, sometimes under conditions of economic duress, and the communal land base of the Pueblo communities shrank significantly. It was not until the Pueblo Lands Act of 1924 that the United States formally acknowledged its responsibility to protect Pueblo lands, and even then the restoration of lands lost since 1848 was incomplete and contested. Some communities recovered significant portions of their land base. Others did not. The legal battles over Pueblo land rights continued well into the second half of the 20th century, and in some cases are ongoing today. All of this is the hidden story of the American Southwest, not the story of heroes and explorers, of missions and conversions, of civilization spreading across the desert, but the story of a landscape inhabited for thousands of years by sophisticated peoples who were subjected to systematic colonial violence, dispossession, and cultural suppression, who survived that process against extraordinary odds, and whose presence and persistence in the landscape they had always occupied is a fact that every honest account of the region's history has to begin with and return to constantly. The version you were taught is not just incomplete. It is organized around the specific purpose of making the dispossession invisible, of centering the colonizers and their achievements, while the people whose land and labor produced those achievements are pushed to the margins, or reduced to passive recipients of European benevolence, or cast as obstacles to progress, or simply left out entirely. Understanding the actual history does not require abandoning any genuine respect for the complexity of human experience, for the real achievements of people who came to this region from Spain, Mexico, and built lives here, for the genuine courage of individuals who crossed deserts and mountains and lived on difficult frontiers. Real people are complex. Real history contains real human beings on every side of every conflict. But acknowledging complexity is not the same as erasing accountability, and the erasure of what actually happened in the Spanish Southwest is not a matter of incomplete records or insufficient evidence. The records exist. The evidence is there. The story has simply not been told in the places where most people learn history. The turquoise in the walls of a Chaco great house is still there. The kiva at Taos is still in use. The ceremonies that the Franciscans tried to suppress in 1675 are still being performed. Pope's name is on a statue in the United States Capitol, placed there in 2005 when the state of New Mexico chose him as one of its 2 representatives in the National Statuary Hall, which means that a man who organized a successful armed revolt against the government of a European colonial power is now represented in the building that houses the legislature of the country that inherited the colonizers' territory. There is something in that fact that the textbook version of history is still not entirely sure how to absorb. What we do with that history, how we teach it, and how we build on it, depends on whether we are willing to look at it honestly. And honesty in this particular case means starting not with Coronado on his horse, not with Oneite planting his cross, but with the people who were there when Coronado arrived, who had been there for thousands of years, and who are still there now. The landscape of the Southwest carries all of this. The ruins of Pueblo Bonito carry it. The walls of Acoma carry it. The stone churches built with conscripted labor at San Antonio de Bexar carry it. The ruts of the Santa Fe Trail carry it. The dry creek beds that the Hohokam canals drained into carry it. Every place in this landscape is a palimpsest, a surface written over and over with different stories by different peoples at different times, and the oldest writing is still the most legible if you know how to read it. The Navajo word for themselves, Dine, means the people. The Hopi word for their own community is Hopitu Shinumu, which translates roughly as the peaceful people who follow the path. The Zuni call themselves Shiwi. The Acoma call themselves Haku. These are old names, carried across long time, and they are still in use. They were in use before Spain arrived. They will be in use long after the current version of Southwestern history has been corrected to include them honestly. That correction is not just a matter of fairness, though it is that. It is a matter of accuracy. History that omits the majority of its own evidence is not history. It is a selective account organized to serve specific interests, and when we recognize it as such, we can begin to ask what a fuller account would look like, and whose voices would need to be heard in order to produce it. The answer, as it turns out, is not primarily the voices of archaeologists and historians, though their work is important. It is the voices of the communities that lived through this history, that remember it through oral tradition and ceremony, and the persistent practice of cultural forms that the colonial project tried and failed to eliminate. Those communities are still here. They are speaking. The question is whether the rest of us are finally willing to listen. There is a river in New Mexico that the Spanish named the Rio Grande, the Big River, and the name stuck so completely that most people today could not tell you what its original names were. The Tiwa-speaking peoples who lived along its banks had their own name for it. The Tiwa called it the Posoge, the Big River Water. The Navajo called it Tubad, the Female River, or sometimes Nihutsoy, the Turbid Water. Each of these names carries a different relationship to the same water, a different history of interaction, a different set of meanings accumulated over generations of living beside it. The name Rio Grande is not wrong. It is just the name given by people who arrived late to a river that had been named many times before. And this particular dynamic, of arriving late and then renaming everything as if nothing had existed before the arrival, is the foundational gesture of the colonial project everywhere, and nowhere more systematically than in the American Southwest. The pre-contact population of the Southwest is another number that rarely appears in textbook accounts, and when it does appear, it is almost always presented as speculative and probably too high. In fact, The methods for estimating pre-contact population have become substantially more sophisticated over the past 30 years, drawing on archaeological settlement pattern data, historical disease progression modeling, and the analysis of early colonial records that contain enough demographic information to permit backward projection. The estimates these methods produce are consistently higher than the numbers that were conventional wisdom 30 years ago, and they consistently move the story in a direction that makes the human cost of colonialism harder to minimize. For the Pueblo-dwelling peoples of the Rio Grande Valley alone, estimates for pre-contact population now generally range between 80,000 and 120,000 people. For the Hohokam of the Phoenix Basin, estimates range from 30 to 50,000 at the culture's peak. For the peoples of the California coast, the inland valleys, and the montane regions, the cumulative population estimates now commonly exceed 300,000 and sometimes reach 500,000. For the peoples of Texas, the Gulf Coast, and the Southern Plains, reliable estimates are harder to construct because the record is thinner, but the numbers are substantial. Add these regional figures together, and you arrive at a pre-contact population for the Southwest and adjacent areas that is measured in the hundreds of thousands. Compare those numbers with the populations documented in the first reasonably reliable Spanish colonial censuses, which occur in New Mexico in the early to mid-17th century, and the scale of the demographic catastrophe that contact and colonization produced becomes unavoidable. The census of 1,601, taken by colonial officials in New Mexico, documented approximately 60,000 Pueblo people in 30 or so active communities along the Rio Grande and its tributaries. By 1680, the year of the Pueblo Revolt, estimates for the surviving Pueblo population had fallen to somewhere between 17,000 and 30,000. The decline between pre-contact figures and the 1,680 count represents the loss of more than half the Pueblo population in roughly 80 years. That loss was not primarily the result of warfare, though warfare played a role. It was primarily the result of epidemic disease, of the disruption of the agricultural systems and food storage networks that had sustained the population, of the chronic stress and increased susceptibility to disease produced by colonial labor demands, and of the collapse of the social and spiritual systems that had organized communal health practices. Disease and colonialism worked together in the Southwest, just as they did everywhere else in the Americas. The Spanish did not bring epidemic diseases to the Southwest intentionally. They did not understand germ theory, had no concept of epidemic disease transmission, and in many cases were themselves killed by the same diseases that devastated indigenous communities. But the structural conditions of colonialism, the concentration of people in missions and in the labor pools required by colonial agriculture, the disruption of traditional food systems, the psychological and physical stress of coercive labor regimes, all of these made indigenous communities far more vulnerable to epidemic disease than they would have been without colonialism. The diseases and the colonial system were not separate forces. They reinforced each other. The four major epidemic events that swept through the Pueblo communities during the 17th century have been reconstructed from mission records and Spanish administrative documents. There was a measles epidemic around 1,640 that the records suggest killed thousands. There was a smallpox epidemic around 1,665 that killed more. There was a drought-driven famine in the early 1670s that killed thousands more and left the surviving population weakened and desperate. And there was a period of intensified Apache raiding in the 1670s, itself partly a consequence of drought and displacement further out on the plains, that added additional pressure to communities already struggling to survive. Pope organized his revolt in 1680 against this background. The communities that rose against the Spanish were not populations at the height of their strength. Making a choice from among many available options, they were populations that had been reduced by roughly half in 80 years, that were being ground down by tribute and labor demands, that had their religious and ceremonial life actively suppressed, and that faced the genuine prospect of simply ceasing to exist as distinct communities if the current trajectory continued. The revolt was, in this light, not just a political statement or a military operation. It was an act of survival. The decision to destroy the Spanish infrastructure after the revolt succeeded was similarly not simply cultural vandalism. When Pope ordered the churches torn down and the Spanish cattle killed and the Spanish tools discarded, he was making a calculated judgment that the things the Spanish had brought with them, the built environment, the livestock economy, the material culture of colonialism, were inseparably connected to the system of exploitation that had nearly destroyed the Pueblo communities, and that genuine recovery required breaking that connection. He may have been wrong about some of this. The livestock, at least, would have been useful to keep. But the judgment that the physical remnants of colonial occupation were not neutral artifacts but were loaded with the meaning of oppression and ought to be expunged was not irrational. The period between 1680 and 1692, the 12 years in which New Mexico was free of Spanish colonial rule, is one of the genuine blank spots in the documentary record of the Southwest, because the Spanish were not there to keep records. What we know about this period comes from later Spanish accounts of what they found when they returned, from archaeological evidence of what changed during those years, and from Pueblo oral traditions that have preserved memory of the period. What the archaeological and documentary record suggests is that the communities did not simply revert to the pre-1598 status quo. Some communities that had been established under colonial influence dispersed. Some communities that had been separate came together. The population that had been distributed across dozens of missions and colonial settlements reconcentrated into fewer, larger, more defensible communities on or near mesa tops. The pottery styles changed, reverting in some ways toward pre-colonial forms and incorporating in other ways new elements that reflected the specific experience of having lived through colonialism. The architecture changed in ways that are visible in the archaeological record of sites occupied during this period. In other words, the Pueblo communities in the 12 years between 1680 and 1692 were not simply recovering a pre-colonial past. They were actively building a post-colonial present, taking what they wanted from the preceding 80 years and discarding what they did not want, negotiating internally about what their communities and their traditions should look like going forward. This was not passive restoration. It was active cultural production by people who had survived extraordinary pressure and were making deliberate choices about their future. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they returned to communities that had spent 12 years reorganizing themselves along lines that the communities themselves had chosen. The reconquest was not the restoration of a pre-existing colonial order. It was the imposition of a new colonial order on communities that had changed, that had agency and memory and judgment, and that would negotiate the terms of their reincorporation into the colonial system in ways that were different from the original submission of 1598. The negotiated quality of the post-1692 relationship between the Spanish and the Pueblo communities is one of the most interesting and least taught aspects of the entire colonial period. Individual communities made different deals with the returning Spanish administration. Some submitted quickly and received relatively favorable terms. Some resisted and were taken by force. Some relocated to avoid the returning Spanish and then gradually allowed the Spanish to re-establish contact. The result was not a uniform colonial system but a patchwork of specific arrangements, some more coercive and some more genuinely reciprocal, that varied from community to community and that changed over time as the specific governors and missionaries changed. The Spanish military expeditions against the Apache and Navajo that intensified in the 18th century sometimes incorporated Pueblo warriors as allies. This is a fact that requires careful handling because it is easy to present it in a way that seems to exonerate the Spanish of any accountability, as if the willingness of some Pueblo men to fight alongside the Spanish against the Apache and Navajo demonstrates that the colonial relationship was genuinely collaborative. In fact, Pueblo participation in Spanish military operations was itself partly a product of the colonial system. reflecting the complex calculations that subject peoples make when they have limited options, not evidence that the colonial relationship was one of equals choosing freely. The Navajo experience of the Spanish colonial system deserves more attention than it typically receives in standard accounts, and the Navajo experience of the American period that followed deserves particular examination because it is one of the clearest cases in American history of the distance between stated policy and actual practice. The Navajo had been in conflict with the Spanish settlements and the Pueblo communities for most of the colonial period, conducting raids and being raided in return, participating in the captive economy, and occupying a position of formal enmity with the colonial administration, even while engaging in trade and exchange that belied the pure antagonism the formal record describes. When the Mexican period ended and the American period began in 1848, the Navajo were simply presented with a new colonial authority in place of the old one, without any genuine negotiation about the terms of their relationship with that authority. Between 1848 and 1863, the American government signed a series of treaties with the Navajo leadership, each of which was quickly violated, each of which was followed by continued conflict, and each of which represents the same pattern of the colonial power making promises it had no intention of keeping in order to achieve specific short-term military and territorial objectives. The final act of this process was the Long Walk. In 1863 and 1864, Colonel Kit Carson conducted a systematic campaign against the Navajo that was explicitly designed not to defeat them in battle, but to destroy the agricultural and pastoral economy that sustained them. His forces burned Navajo cornfields. They killed Navajo livestock. They cut down the peach orchards in Canyon de Chelly that the Navajo had been cultivating for generations. They denied the Navajo access to water sources and forced them into territory where starvation was the intended outcome. When the Navajo surrendered in large numbers in the winter and spring of 1864, they were marched 300 miles to a concentration camp at a place called Bosque Redondo, near Fort Sumner in eastern New Mexico. The conditions at Bosque Redondo, which the Navajo call Huildi, a word that translates approximately as the place of suffering, were lethal. The land was inadequate for agriculture. The water was contaminated with alkali. There was insufficient firewood. The food rations provided by the government were consistently below what was needed to sustain health. Disease was endemic. In 4 years of forced residence at Bosque Redondo, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 Navajo people died of disease, starvation, and the effects of chronic deprivation. This represents a substantial fraction of the entire Navajo population, which at the time of the Long Walk was perhaps 12 to 15,000 people. This is not a minor episode that can be noted briefly and moved past. This is a deliberate campaign by the United States military to destroy the economic foundation of a people and then hold the survivors in conditions that an impartial observer would characterize as genocidal. It is rarely taught at all in American schools. When it is taught, it is typically presented as a well-intentioned, if misguided, attempt to resolve a persistent frontier conflict, a framing that inverts the actual moral structure of what occurred. The reason the Navajo survived Bosque Redondo as a people, returned to their territory in 1868 through the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, and rebuilt their community and their economy across the subsequent century, is one of the remarkable stories of human resilience and cultural continuity in American history. The sheep they brought back from Bosque Redondo, the weaving tradition that had been maintained even during the years of imprisonment, the ceremonial life that continued in the camps despite everything, these were the foundations of the recovery. They are also almost never told in the context in which they belong, which is the context of a people who had been subjected to deliberate destruction by the United States government, and who rebuilt despite that destruction, not with the help of the government, but in the face of its sustained hostility. The Treaty of 1868, that ended the Long Walk, established the Navajo Reservation, which was smaller than the territory the Navajo had previously occupied. In the century that followed, the boundaries of the reservation were periodically expanded, contracted, and contested. The federal government's relationship with the Navajo, as with virtually every other indigenous nation in the Southwest, was characterized by the same pattern that had characterized the Spanish colonial relationship, a pattern of making promises when promises were convenient and breaking them when keeping them became inconvenient or expensive. The Navajo Livestock Reduction Program of the 1930s, in which the federal government forced the destruction of hundreds of thousands of Navajo sheep and goats as a supposed conservation measure, is another episode in this history that is rarely discussed. The program was driven by concern that overgrazing was causing erosion that was filling up Lake Mead, the newly constructed reservoir behind Hoover Dam. The conservation concern was real. The method chosen to address it, which was to destroy the primary economic resource of one of the most economically marginal populations in the country, was devastating, and was implemented in ways that showed complete disregard for the economic and cultural impact on the Navajo. Families that had built their economic stability around herds of sheep found those herds reduced by government agents, who sometimes simply shot the animals in front of their owners. The economic consequences lasted for a generation. The psychological and cultural consequences, in a community where sheep were not merely an economic asset, but were embedded in ceremonial practice and in the gendered division of labor and in the transmission of knowledge from older to younger women, were equally profound and equally lasting. And yet, the Navajo Nation today is the largest land-based indigenous nation in the United States. With a reservation of more than 17 million acres and a population of more than 300,000 people, the Navajo language remains vital, spoken by a larger number of people than many European minority languages that receive far more international attention and support. The weaving tradition continues. The ceremonial calendar continues, the political institutions of the nation continue, and all of this despite and in the face of everything that has been done to prevent it. Hopi territory, surrounded by but separate from the Navajo reservation, carries its own version of this story. The Hopi are among the direct descendants of the ancestral Puebloans who built Chaco Canyon, and their mesas in northeastern Arizona have been continuously occupied for more than 1,000 years. The Hopi survived the Spanish colonial period through geographic isolation and consistent resistance to demands that would have compromised their ceremonial and social life. The Hopi villages on the first, second, and third mesas, some of which are among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in North America, maintained their character through the colonial period and into the American period with a remarkable degree of continuity. The Hopi experience of the American period was shaped significantly by the establishment of a day school and then boarding school system that attempted to remove Hopi children from their communities and educate them in the values and practices of Anglo-American civilization, on the theory that if the children were sufficiently removed from their cultural context, the process of assimilation that voluntary contact had failed to achieve could be accomplished by force. The boarding school system, which operated not only in Hopi territory but across the entire Southwest and indeed across the entire continent, is one of the most extensively documented and least publicly understood dimensions of American Indian policy. Children were taken from their families, sometimes with the complicity of parents who hoped their children would learn skills useful in navigating the American economy, sometimes by government agents who simply took them against the family's wishes. At the schools, which were often run by religious organizations under federal contract, children were forbidden to speak their own languages, practice their own ceremonies, or maintain their own dress or appearance. The stated purpose of the boarding school system, as articulated by Richard Henry Pratt, who founded the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania in 1879, was to kill the Indian and save the man. This was not a metaphor. It was a description of what the program intended to do, which was to destroy indigenous cultural identity in individuals while preserving their biological lives. The schools succeeded in producing graduates who could speak English, who had skills that were useful in the American economy, and who were profoundly traumatized by the experience of having their cultural identity systematically attacked during their formative years. They did not succeed in eliminating indigenous cultural identity, which survived not only in communities but in the private practice and interior lives of individuals who were told that their heritage was something to be ashamed of and who refused, internally, to accept that judgment. The intergenerational trauma produced by the boarding school system is one of the most significant and least acknowledged dimensions of the current social and economic conditions in Indigenous communities across the Southwest. The communities that show the highest rates of poverty, substance abuse, health disparities, and educational underachievement today are communities that experience the most intensive and most sustained contact with the colonial and then American systems that systematically destroyed the social structures and knowledge transmission systems that had sustained them. This is not coincidence, it is causation, and the causal chain runs from the 16th century to the present. The Hopi-Navajo land dispute, which dominated federal Indian policy in the Southwest during the last decades of the 20th century, is a case study in how the legacies of colonial history produce consequences that continue to shape Indigenous life long after the formal colonial period is over. The dispute arose from a set of overlapping land claims, with the Hopi asserting traditional rights to land that the federal government had formally assigned to the Navajo reservation in various boundary adjustments over the decades, and the Navajo asserting their own rights to land they had been occupying for generations. The federal government's resolution of this dispute, through the Navajo-Hopi Land Settlement Act of 1974 and its subsequent amendments, involved the forced relocation of thousands of Navajo families and hundreds of Hopi families from the Hopi partitioned lands and the Navajo partitioned lands respectively. The Navajo relocations in particular were the largest forced relocation of Indigenous people in the United States since the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Families that had lived in specific locations for multiple generations were required to move, their homes demolished, their livestock removed. The program was justified as a resolution of an ancient tribal dispute, and the framing was successful enough that many Americans who know about the Hopi-Navajo land dispute understand it primarily as a conflict between two indigenous nations that the federal government had to reluctantly adjudicate. This framing obscures the degree to which the dispute itself was a product of federal policy decisions, of the way the reservation boundaries had been drawn, redrawn, and overlaid on each other in ways that made conflict essentially inevitable. The federal government was not a neutral arbiter of an ancient dispute. It was the original architect of the conditions that produced the dispute, and its resolution of that dispute, which involved the forced removal of thousands of people from their homes, was continuous with the same logic that had produced the Long Walk and the boarding schools. The water of the Southwest is another dimension of this story that deserves careful attention. The Rio Grande, the Colorado River, the Salt River, the Gila River, these waterways were the arteries of pre-contact civilization in the region. The Hohokam built their canal systems around the Salt and Gila rivers. The Pueblo communities of the Rio Grande Valley organized their agriculture around the seasonal flows of the river and its tributaries. The Navajo and Hopi people had water rights, in both the legal and the moral sense, that derived from generations of use and from treaty promises. The allocation of Western water through the system of prior appropriation, which assigns water rights on the basis of who filed the first legal claim rather than who had been using the water longest, systematically disadvantaged Indigenous communities. Legal water rights under the prior appropriation system could only be acquired by filing claims in the American legal system, and Indigenous communities often did not have access to legal representation, did not understand the American system's requirements, and did not learn until it was too late that they were required to file claims or lose rights to water their communities had depended on for centuries. The Supreme Court decision in Winters, United States in 1908, established the principle that when the federal government created an Indian reservation, it implicitly reserved enough water to make the reservation livable, and that this implied water right dated to the date of the reservation's creation, giving it priority over later non-Indian claims. This principle, the Winters Doctrine, was an important legal protection. but its application has been contested in hundreds of court cases over the century since the decision. Determining exactly how much water is necessary to make a reservation livable, quantifying that amount, and negotiating the specific terms of settlement agreements has consumed enormous amounts of legal and political energy, and the outcomes have been consistently less favorable to Indigenous communities than the letter of the Winters Doctrine would suggest they should be. The Colorado River, which supplies water to Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico, as well as to Mexico, was allocated among the states in the Colorado River Compact of 1,922 without any meaningful participation by the indigenous nations whose treaty rights to the river predated every state involved in the compact. The compact divided the river based on calculations that overestimated the river's average flow and that assigned to Arizona alone nearly as much water as the river actually delivers in most years. The resulting conflicts over Colorado River water have occupied courts, legislatures, and federal agencies for a century, and indigenous water rights have remained a subordinate concern throughout, addressed incompletely in a series of individual settlements that have never produced a comprehensive resolution of the outstanding claims. The land and water issues are not abstract legal questions. They are material conditions that shape the daily lives of hundreds of thousands of people in the Southwest today. The rate of water poverty on Navajo Nation, where a substantial fraction of the population lacks access to running water in their homes, is a direct consequence of the incomplete resolution of Navajo water rights that stretches back through the entire American period to the colonial period before it. Families that haul water in trucks because their homes lack plumbing are living in conditions produced by the cumulative weight of 500 years of colonial policy decisions, and the connection between those policy decisions and the current conditions is not speculative. It is documented in the legal and administrative record. The environmental history of the Southwest is itself a story that rarely gets told in connection with the colonial history, though the two are inseparable. The landscape of the Southwest today, with its specific distribution of vegetation, its pattern of erosion and deposition, its water table characteristics, its wildlife populations, is not a natural condition. It is a historical product, shaped by thousands of years of indigenous land management, and then by 300 years of colonial and American exploitation that systematically dismantled the indigenous land management systems and replaced them with practices that treated the landscape as a resource to be extracted rather than a system to be maintained. The grasslands of the southern plains and the desert Southwest supported enormous bison populations before the colonial period. The bison were not simply wild animals that happened to be in the landscape. They were, in some respects, a managed population, maintained by the combination of fire management by indigenous peoples and the natural ecology of the grassland system. The collapse of bison populations during the 19th century, which was deliberate American policy in some respects and incidental market hunting in others, removed a key element of the ecological system that had sustained the grasslands, contributing to the erosion and desertification that would produce the Dust Bowl conditions of the 1930s. The forests of the Southwest are similarly a historical product. The ponderosa pine forests of the Colorado Plateau and the Sky Islands of southern Arizona were maintained by regular low-intensity fires set by indigenous peoples that prevented the accumulation of undergrowth and reduced the risk of catastrophic high-intensity fires. When the United States Forest Service policy of total fire suppression was implemented in the early 20th century, it allowed decades of undergrowth accumulation, creating the conditions for the catastrophic wildfires that have increasingly characterized the Southwest in recent decades. The return to managed fire practices that contemporary forest management is cautiously beginning to implement is, in a very real sense, the rediscovery of indigenous land management knowledge that was suppressed rather than learned. The archaeologists who excavate sites in the Southwest, the ecologists who study the region's vegetation and hydrology, the historians who work in colonial archives, and the indigenous peoples whose oral traditions carry knowledge that none of these other sources contain, are all looking at different dimensions of the same landscape, the same history, the same set of questions about what happened here and why it matters. The textbook version that most Americans carry in their heads, the version with the conquistador on his horse, and the mission church, and the peaceful assimilation, captures almost none of what these different disciplines and perspectives reveal. The corrected version is not simpler than the textbook version. It is far more complex, involving multiple peoples with multiple histories and relationships that ranged from genuine mutual benefit to organized violence, played out across a landscape that was itself a historical actor, changing and being changed by the human activity occurring on it. Complexity is not comfortable. It does not fit neatly into the kind of story that can be told in a paragraph and a half on the way to the Civil War chapter. But complexity is what actually happened. And if we are going to understand the Southwest today, understanding the communities that live there now, the economic conditions, the water crises, the land tenure disputes, the public health challenges, the extraordinary persistence of languages and ceremonies and architectural traditions that have survived everything thrown at them, we have to understand how those conditions came to be. We have to follow the causal chains back to their origins. And those origins are not in 1848, when the United States acquired the territory. They are not in 1821, when Mexico achieved independence. They are not in 1598, when Oneate crossed the Rio Grande. They reach back thousands of years before any of that, to the civilizations that built Chaco Canyon and engineered the Hohokam canals and painted the Mimbres bowls, and they run forward continuously from there to the present moment. That continuous thread is what the textbook version does not want to show you, because if you see the continuous thread, you cannot pretend that what happened was either inevitable or neutral. You cannot pretend that the current conditions of indigenous communities in the Southwest are simply the way things naturally settled out after a complicated historical process. You have to look at the decisions that were made, the policies that were implemented, the promises that were broken, and ask what they were for and who they served and who paid the cost. And when you ask those questions honestly, you get answers that demand something of you, some response, some acknowledgement, some reckoning. And that is why the textbook version tells you Coronado was looking for the 7 cities of gold instead. There is a building in Taos, New Mexico that has been continuously inhabited for somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years. It is a multi-story adobe structure built on the north side of a small stream that flows out of the mountains behind the pueblo, and people are living in it right now, today, as you read or listen to these words. There are no electric lights inside, no indoor plumbing, no gas heat. The people who live in the upper stories of Taos Pueblo are there by choice, maintaining an ancient way of living in an ancient space not because they have no other options but because the continuity matters to them, because the building itself is part of who they are, because living in the place where your ancestors lived for 1,000 years means something that cannot be replicated by moving somewhere more convenient. This is not a museum exhibit. It is a home, and the fact that it has been a home continuously for 1,000 years, despite the Spanish colonial system, despite the American period, despite the pressures and disruptions and forced changes and broken promises of 5 centuries of colonial contact, is one of the most remarkable facts about the American Southwest and one of the most consistently overlooked. The textbook version of Southwestern history ends, more or less, when the Americans arrive. The Spanish period gets a chapter, usually focused on missions and explorers. The Mexican period gets a paragraph, usually about the Santa Fe Trail and American settlers moving in. The American acquisition gets a sentence or two about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and then the history of the Southwest becomes American history, focused on the railroad, the cattle industry, the mining booms, the growth of the cities, and the transformation of the arid landscape into a productive part of the national economy. What gets left out in this transition is almost everything. The Pueblo communities that survived the Spanish period did not simply become background characters in an American story. The Navajo Nation, which endured the long walk and rebuilt, did not simply fade into the landscape of the Western narrative. The Hopi, the Zuni, the various Apache nations, the Tohono O'odham, the Yaqui communities in southern Arizona, none of these peoples simply stopped having history when the American period began. They continued to be the primary political actors in their own territories, continued to negotiate, resist, adapt, and insist on their presence in the landscape, and continued to be systematically underrepresented in the accounts that claimed to be telling the history of the places they had always lived. The story of the Santa Fe Trail, which opened in 1821 when Mexico achieved independence from Spain, and which carried American trade goods into New Mexico for the next quarter century, is usually told as a story of American entrepreneurial energy and frontier enterprise. William Becknell and the wagon trains and the economic opportunity and the adventure. What gets much less attention is what the Santa Fe Trail meant for the communities it passed through, the Comanche and Kiowa communities on the southern plains, who were initially paid tolls for passage through their territory and who found their authority over that territory progressively eroded as the volume of traffic increased and as American military pressure built behind the trade. Caravans. The Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, which produced the acquisition of the Southwest by the United States, is typically framed in American accounts as a conflict between the United States and Mexico over the annexation of Texas and the disputed border of the Rio Grande. This framing is not wrong, but it obscures the degree to which the war was also a conflict fought in and over territories inhabited by indigenous peoples who were not consulted about the change of sovereignty and whose interests were not represented in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that ended it. General Stephen Watts Kearny, who commanded the Army of the West that occupied New Mexico in 1846, famously announced to the population of Santa Fe that they were now American citizens and would receive all the protections of American law. The announcement was delivered to a population that included Pueblo people who had been nominally Spanish, then nominally Mexican, and were now being made nominally American, with no consultation, no negotiation, and no particular reason to believe that the new sovereign power would be any more faithful to its promises than the previous ones had been. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did include specific language protecting the property rights of Mexican citizens in the ceded territory. Article 8 and Article 9 of the treaty committed the United States to respect those rights. The Pueblo communities of New Mexico had formal land grants issued by the Spanish Crown and confirmed by the Mexican government, and those grants were supposed to be protected by the treaty. The history of how those commitments were kept is, as we have already touched on, a history of systematic failure to honor them. But the acquisition of the Southwest also brought the United States face to face with a set of military and political challenges that it had not anticipated and was not prepared to address. The Apache and Navajo communities that had been in conflict with the Spanish and Mexican colonial administration were now in conflict with the American military, and the American military was no better equipped than the Spanish had been to achieve a decisive military victory against peoples who operated on a mobile, guerrilla basis across terrain that heavily favored those who knew it intimately. The Fort Sumner era and the Long Walk, which we have already discussed, represent the moment when the American military arrived at a strategy that could achieve the military objective of stopping Apache and Navajo raiding, which was not military defeat of those peoples in battle, but destruction of their economic base. The strategy worked, in the narrow military sense, but it produced consequences that the American military and the American government did not have a plan to address, which was what to do with tens of thousands of people whose previous way of life had been destroyed and who were now dependent on the federal government for survival. The reservation system that emerged from the military campaigns of the 1860s and 1870s was not designed with the welfare of the people being confined to reservations as its primary goal. It was designed to separate indigenous peoples from land that American settlers wanted, to contain them in defined territories where they could be managed at minimal cost, and to subject them to a program of cultural transformation that would eventually, it was hoped, make them indistinguishable from the general American population. The reservations established in the Southwest in this period were generally situated on land that American settlers did not want. Land that was too arid, too remote, too high in elevation, or too poor in resources to attract agricultural or ranching development. The assumption underlying the reservation placement was that the land did not matter very much because the people on it were going to be assimilated into American society eventually anyway. This assumption was wrong in two ways. The people resisted assimilation far more effectively than the theory predicted, and the land, which had seemed economically worthless in the 1870s, turned out to contain substantial mineral and energy resources that became enormously valuable in the 20th century. The discovery of uranium deposits on the Navajo Nation, oil and gas on the Osage Reservation in Oklahoma, coal on the Hopi and Navajo lands in the Black Mesa area, timber in the mountain reservations of the Southwest, these discoveries transformed the economic stakes of the reservation system and introduced a new dimension of exploitation that the 19th century architects of the system could not have anticipated. The mineral wealth under reservation land generated enormous revenues, but those revenues consistently flowed away from the communities on the land and toward the energy companies and the federal government, with indigenous communities receiving royalties that were in many cases fraudulently calculated and systematically underpaid. The Navajo uranium mining story is one of the most devastating and least publicized environmental and public health disasters in American history. From the late 1940s through the 1980s, uranium was mined extensively on the Navajo Nation to supply the American nuclear weapons program and later the civilian nuclear power industry. The mining companies and the federal government knew that uranium mining was dangerous, that the radon gas produced by uranium decay caused lung cancer, and that the miners were being exposed to levels far above what was considered safe. Navajo miners were not informed of these risks. They were not provided with safety equipment that could have reduced their exposure. They were not told that the radioactive dust they brought home on their clothes and in their hair was contaminating their families and their homes. And when the mines were closed and the companies moved on, they left behind hundreds of abandoned mine sites, piles of radioactive tailings, contaminated water sources, and communities with elevated rates of lung cancer, kidney disease, and birth defects that persist to this day. The federal government's response to this situation has been characterized by the same pattern visible throughout the history we have been examining: initial denial of responsibility, protracted legal battles, partial settlements that acknowledge some liability while limiting the government's actual financial exposure, cleanup programs that moved slowly and left substantial contamination in place, and a systematic under-resourcing of the health monitoring and treatment programs that affected communities needed. The same government that had benefited from the uranium production, that had in some cases actively recruited Navajo men to work in the mines, spent decades disputing its responsibility for the consequences. The Black Mesa coal mining story follows a similar pattern. The coal deposits under Black Mesa, which sits in the heart of the Hopi and Navajo territories in northeastern Arizona, were developed beginning in the 1960s by Peabody Coal Company, which obtained leases from the Hopi and Navajo tribal governments under circumstances that have been contested as involving conflicts of interest, inadequate legal representation of the tribes, and the deliberate misrepresentation of the financial terms. The mining used enormous quantities of water drawn from the Navajo Aquifer, an ancient groundwater source that had been formed over tens of thousands of years and that could not be replenished on any human timescale. Communities dependent on the aquifer for drinking water found their wells dropping and in some cases running dry. The mining produced income for the tribal governments but left a landscape of strip-mined land, contaminated water, and depleted groundwater that will require generations to even partially recover. The Hopi-Navajo land dispute of the 1970s and 1980s, which resulted in the forced relocation of thousands of families, was itself partly a product of the coal situation, because the coal deposits lay in the disputed territory and the relocation of Navajo families from the Hopi partitioned lands cleared the way for further coal development. This is a dimension of the land dispute that is almost never mentioned in accounts that frame it purely as a tribal conflict. The water situation in the Southwest today is the direct inheritor of all of this history. The Colorado River, which has been over-allocated since the 1922 Compact, is now under acute stress from a combination of the original overallocation, the long-term drying trend produced by climate change, and the continued growth of water demands from the cities and agricultural operations that depend on it. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, the reservoirs behind Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam respectively, dropped to historically low levels in 2021 and 2022, triggering federal water shortage declarations and mandatory cuts to water deliveries downstream. The indigenous communities of the Southwest hold water rights that were promised by treaty and by the Winters Doctrine, but that have never been fully quantified or fully delivered. As the overall water situation becomes more acute, the pressure to resolve those outstanding indigenous water rights claims is increasing, but so is the resistance from other water users who do not want their allocations reduced to accommodate rights they would prefer to pretend do not exist. The Colorado River Indian tribes, whose reservation along the lower Colorado River in Arizona includes some of the most productive agricultural land in the Southwest, hold significant water rights that they have recently begun to exercise in ways that other Colorado River water users have found challenging. The tribes are legally entitled to water that they have not historically consumed in full, and their assertion of those rights is both legally correct and politically contentious, in a region where every drop of water is already committed to someone else's use. The Tohono O'odham Nation, whose reservation in southern Arizona straddles the United States-Mexico border, is dealing with a set of challenges that make the abstract historical patterns visible in a very concrete and immediate way. The O'odham people have lived in the Sonoran Desert, on both sides of what is now the international border, for thousands of years. The border itself, established in 1853 through the Gadsden Purchase, cut through O'odham territory without consulting the O'odham, and has divided families and communities ever since. The intensification of border enforcement beginning in the 1990s, which funneled undocumented migration through the most remote and dangerous desert terrain, including large portions of the Tohono O'odham Reservation, produced a humanitarian crisis on O'odham land. Migrants died crossing the desert in enormous numbers. The reservation became littered with the material detritus of desperate border crossings. The O'odham community was subject to increased law enforcement presence and surveillance, and the O'odham people who had family members across the border found it increasingly difficult to maintain those connections. The construction of the border wall through portions of O'odham territory under the Trump administration in 2019 and 2020 damaged sacred sites, disrupted wildlife corridors that O'odham land management had maintained for generations, and was carried out with minimal consultation with the tribal government, despite the formal requirements of federal law for consultation with affected indigenous nations. The wall crosses territory that the O'odham have used for thousands of years, as though the O'odham presence there were simply a natural feature to be accommodated, no more relevant to the decision than a dry wash or a mountain pass. The O'odham experience with the border wall is a particularly visible example of a pattern that repeats throughout the history we have been examining. The interests of indigenous communities are treated as subordinate to the interests of the state. Their legal rights are acknowledged in principle and then overridden in practice when they conflict with other priorities, and the obligation to consult and to respect those rights is met minimally or not at all when meeting it fully would be inconvenient. The specific mechanisms change over time, from Spanish colonial tribute demands to American eminent domain to federal environmental review waivers, but the underlying structure remains consistent. The language of this history matters too. The words used to describe what happened in the Southwest, discovery, settlement, civilization, development, these are words that encode specific assumptions about who was present before European contact, what that presence was worth, and what was gained and lost through the process of colonization. The alternative vocabulary, invasion, conquest, dispossession, displacement, these words are resisted because they suggest accountability, and they assign moral weight to events that the standard account wants to present as neutral or positive. The debate about language is not trivial. Language shapes perception. When you call what Spain did in New Mexico settlement, you embed in your description of the event the assumption that the land was unoccupied or underoccupied, that the Spanish were filling a void, When you call it conquest, you acknowledge that there were people there who did not want the Spanish to come and who resisted their arrival. Both words are doing historical work, and the choice between them is a choice about whose perspective you are adopting and whose interests you are centering. The same dynamic applies to the way the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is typically described. In textbook accounts that mention it at all, it is usually called a rebellion, which implies that the people who organized it were rejecting a legitimate authority. If you describe it as a revolution or as a successful decolonization, you acknowledge that the authority being rejected was not legitimate, that the Spanish colonial system was an imposition on people who had never consented to it and who were exercising a right of self-determination when they expelled it. The choice of words is a political choice disguised as a descriptive one. The Spanish colonial system in the Southwest was not uniquely brutal by the standards of European colonialism of its era. The violence at Acoma, the public floggings of the 1,675 religious leaders, the labor draft and tribute demands, all of these had counterparts in British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonial practice across the Americas. Comparative cruelty is not a particularly useful frame for understanding what happened. What is useful is recognizing that the Spanish system, like all the colonial systems of the era, was organized around the fundamental premise that the lives and interests of indigenous peoples were subordinate to the interests of the colonial power, and that this premise was not a byproduct of colonialism but its foundation. That premise did not end with the Spanish period. It was inherited, in modified legal and administrative form, by the Mexican Republic and then by the United States. The specific mechanisms of oppression changed. The legal language changed. The religious justifications were replaced by secular ones, and the rhetoric of saving souls was replaced by the rhetoric of assimilation and progress. But the fundamental premise, that indigenous life and indigenous land tenure were subject to the overriding authority of the state and the market, remained continuous from the 16th century to the present. Understanding this continuity is not an exercise in assigning blame across centuries. It is an exercise in understanding the present. The conditions of indigenous communities in the Southwest today, the poverty rates, the health disparities, the environmental contamination, the water insecurity, the educational challenges, these are not mysteries to be explained by cultural deficiency or by some inherent characteristic of the people experiencing them. They are outcomes of specific policy decisions, specific legal structures, specific economic arrangements that have their origins in the colonial period and that have been maintained, modified, and in some cases intensified through the American period. Recognizing this is the beginning of the ability to address it. You cannot effectively address a problem if you misunderstand its origins. And the American public's misunderstanding of the origins of indigenous poverty in the Southwest is one of the most important consequences of the textbook version of Southwestern history that we have been examining throughout this account. The sacred sites controversy is another contemporary manifestation of this historical continuity. Across the Southwest, indigenous communities have sacred sites, places of ceremonial significance, places connected to origin stories and to the spiritual geography of the landscape that are located on land that is now under federal, state, or private ownership. The legal protection of those sites is inconsistent and often inadequate. The National Historic Preservation Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act provide some protection, but both statutes have been interpreted by the courts in ways that significantly limit their practical effect. The Oak Flat copper mining controversy in Arizona, where a proposed copper mine would destroy a site sacred to the San Carlos Apache people, is one of the most visible current examples of this conflict. Apache Leap, another sacred site in the same general area, was damaged by a different mining operation decades ago. The pattern of sacred sites being destroyed or threatened by extractive industry is not new, and the legal and political battles over Oak Flat and similar sites are continuous with the same dynamic that saw Coronado's forces enter Hawiku uninvited and Onate burn Acoma. Monument Valley, the iconic landscape of red sandstone buttes that appears in 100 Western films and has become perhaps the most recognizable image of the American Southwest, is Navajo land. The tourists who visit it, the filmmakers who filmed there, the advertisers who use its image to sell everything from cars to cigarettes, are using a landscape that belongs to the Navajo Nation, that is sacred to the Navajo people, and whose visual exploitation generates revenue that flows primarily out of the Navajo community rather than into it. The Navajo Nation does receive tourism revenue from Monument Valley, and the Navajo Tribal Park there generates income for the nation. But the scale of the commercial use of Monument Valley's image vastly exceeds the scale of the compensation the Navajo receive for it, and the history of how that landscape came to be available for commercial exploitation leads directly back to the colonial history we have been tracing. The ancestral Puebloan sites that draw tourists to the Four Corners region, Mesa Verde in Colorado, Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, Canyon de Chelly in Arizona, these are now managed by the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management as public lands. They are magnificent. They are important. They are genuinely worth visiting and worth protecting. But the management of those sites as public lands, as American national heritage, rather than as indigenous heritage, in active custody of the communities whose ancestors built them, reflects a set of decisions made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries about what those places were and who they belonged to. Those decisions were made without meaningful consultation with the communities most directly connected to those places, and they have produced ongoing tensions between the federal management agencies and the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and the Hopi Nation, who regard these sites not as archaeological curiosities, but as places deeply connected to their living traditions. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990, which required institutions holding indigenous human remains and sacred objects acquired under federal authority to return those items to the communities they came from, was a significant step toward acknowledging the rights of indigenous communities over their own cultural heritage. Its implementation has been slow and contested, and museums and universities have frequently moved more slowly than the law required. But the principle it embodied, that the dead of indigenous communities deserve the same respect as the dead of any other community, that the sacred objects of living traditions belong to those traditions rather than to the institutions that collected them, was an important acknowledgement that the exploitation of indigenous cultural heritage had been wrong. The broader principle of cultural sovereignty, the right of indigenous communities to maintain and transmit their own languages, ceremonial practices, artistic traditions, and governance systems, has been progressively acknowledged in federal Indian policy since the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975, which began shifting control over federal programs from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to tribal governments. The process of self-determination has been real and has produced genuine improvements in the capacity of tribal governments to serve their own communities. It has also been inconsistent, underfunded, and constrained by federal oversight requirements that perpetuate the fundamental dependency relationship between tribal governments and the federal government. The Navajo Nation, with its large land base, substantial population, and relatively well-developed governmental infrastructure, has been able to exercise self-determination more effectively than smaller or less resource-rich nations. But even the Navajo Nation's government operates within constraints imposed by the federal trust relationship that reflect the colonial structure of American Indian policy, constraints that would be unacceptable if imposed on any state or municipality. The Pueblo communities of New Mexico have maintained their traditional governance systems, the Council of Governors, and the traditional leadership structures that predate Spanish colonization, alongside the formal structures required to interact with the federal government. This dual governance structure is itself a remarkable achievement, a product of the negotiated post 1680 accommodation between the Pueblo communities and the Spanish colonial system that allowed indigenous governance to survive in parallel with colonial administration, and that has continued to function through the Mexican period and the American period, because the Pueblo communities chose to maintain it and had enough political and cultural coherence to do so. The survival of the Pueblo communities as distinct political, linguistic, and ceremonial entities through 500 years of colonial contact is the most important fact about the American Southwest that the textbook version of that history fails to communicate. It is important not because it makes a tidy story of resilience and triumph, though there is real resilience and real achievement here. It is important because it demonstrates that the colonial project did not succeed in its fundamental goal. The goal of the Spanish colonial system in the Southwest was to transform the indigenous peoples of the region into Catholic Spanish-speaking subjects of the Crown, people who would be docile, laboring, tribute-paying participants in the colonial economy. The goal of the American system that followed was to transform those same peoples into assimilated American citizens, people who would abandon their tribal identities and become interchangeable with the general population. Neither project succeeded. The Pueblo people of the Rio Grande Valley speak their own languages. They perform their own ceremonies. They maintain their own governance systems. They still live, in many cases, in the same communities where they have lived for 1,000 years. The Navajos still weave, still speak Diné Bizard, still maintain the ceremonial traditions that survived the Long Walk. The Hopi still plant their corn on the same mesas where their ancestors planted it 1,000 years ago. These are not remnants. These are living expressions of cultures that proved, across 5 centuries of sustained colonial pressure, more durable than the systems that tried to eliminate them. That durability deserves to be understood, not romanticized. The communities that survived did so at enormous cost, with enormous losses, through choices and adaptations and negotiations that were often agonizing. Many things were lost that cannot be recovered. Languages spoken by communities that no longer exist. Ceremonies that died with the last person who knew them. Knowledge of plants and landscapes and waterways that was not passed on because the conditions for passing it on were deliberately destroyed. The survival of much does not make the loss of some acceptable. Both the survival and the loss are part of the honest account. The honest account is also the more interesting account. The textbook version, with its clean arc from exploration to settlement to American destiny, is a boring story. The kind of story that erases all the actual drama and complexity and moral weight of what happened. The actual history, with its revolts and accommodations and adaptations and resistances, with its archaeological mysteries and its continuing legal battles, with its living languages and its contaminated aquifers, with its star-aligned buildings and its cancer rates, is a far more interesting story. It is a story worth knowing, not just because it is true, which it is, but because understanding it changes how you see the landscape you are in, whether you are in it physically or encountering it through the images and texts that have been built on top of it. The next time you see an image of the Southwest, the red rock country, the desert sky, the adobe walls, see it as what it actually is. A landscape that has been shaped by human hands for thousands of years. A landscape whose current appearance reflects not only the natural processes of wind and water, but the specific historical processes of colonization and resistance. A landscape inhabited by communities whose roots run deeper than the colonial period by far, who are here now, who have always been here, and who will be here long after the current version of the story that this landscape is told through has been corrected to include them honestly. That correction is not just a matter of academic integrity, though it is that. It is a matter of what we mean when we say that this is a country that reckons honestly with its past. A country that cannot look honestly at what happened in the Southwest, at what Spain did and what Mexico did and what the United States did, is a country that is still, in a very real sense, living in the colonial story rather than beyond it. The work of getting beyond it begins with the work of seeing it clearly. And seeing it clearly means starting where this account started. Not with Coronado on his horse, not with the Spanish flag planted in desert sand, but with the people who were already there, who had been there for thousands of years, who had built cities and roads and canal systems and astronomical observatories before anyone in Europe had heard the name of the continent they were living on, and who are still there now, still speaking their languages, still performing their ceremonies, still insisting, through the simple act of continuing to exist as themselves, that the story does not begin where the textbook says it does. It begins much earlier, and it is still being written. Let's talk about what actually happens when a history is suppressed. Not the dramatic kind of suppression, not the burning of books or the arrest of scholars, but the quieter, more persistent kind that operates through omission, through the selection of what is worth teaching and what is not, through the choices made in curriculum standards and textbook contracts and the allocation of classroom time. This quiet suppression is harder to identify, precisely because it does not announce itself. It simply produces a population that knows certain things and does not know other things, and that tends to mistake the boundaries of what it knows for the boundaries of what happened. The people who wrote the history curricula that produced the standard account of the American Southwest were not, for the most part, consciously concealing anything. They were working within the assumptions of their time, which were shaped by a set of foundational commitments about what history was for, which was to produce a coherent national narrative about who the subjects of that narrative were, which was primarily the European settlers and their descendants, and about what the purpose of studying the past was, which was to understand how the present came to be. Within those assumptions, the suppression of Indigenous history was not a choice. It was a consequence. But consequences have consequences. The generations of Americans educated in this system learned to think of the Southwest as a region whose important history began with European contact, and whose indigenous peoples were interesting primarily as a backdrop, a setting for the story of European expansion rather than as the main actors in a much longer and more complex drama. They learned to think of the present conditions of indigenous communities as the natural outcome of historical processes, rather than as the produced outcomes of specific policy choices. They learned to think of Pueblo Bonito as an archaeological site rather than as a building that belongs to living people. And they learned to think of the Pueblo Revolt as a minor historical footnote, rather than as one of the most significant political events in the history of the continent. All of these learned misperceptions have practical consequences. When voters and legislators and judges and administrators have been educated in the standard version of Southwestern history, they bring those misperceptions to decisions about water rights and land claims and environmental regulations and tribal sovereignty. The misperceptions do not have to be conscious or malicious to be consequential. They simply have to be present, quietly shaping what seems obvious and what seems like it requires special justification. The Winters Doctrine, for instance, which establishes the principle that Indian reservations carry implied water rights from their date of creation, requires special justification in the American legal system, because the default assumption of prior appropriation water law is that water rights belong to whoever filed for them under the American legal system, that the people living on the reservation had been using the water for thousands of years before the reservation was created, before the American legal system existed, before anyone in the region knew what a water right was in the American legal sense, does not appear as a factor in the prior appropriation system, because that system was designed by and for people whose relationship with the landscape began when they filed a legal claim. To make the Winters Doctrine work, you have to argue against the default assumption of the system. You have to make the affirmative case that the implied reservation of water rights exists, that it predates later filings, that it matters more than the expectations of the people who filed claims under the assumption that reservation water rights were negligible. This is a harder legal argument than it should be, and it is harder precisely because the default assumption is the product of a history that treated indigenous presence as irrelevant to the allocation of resources. The archaeology of the Southwest is another area where the standard account has produced practical consequences by shaping what gets studied, funded, and protected. The early decades of Southwestern archaeology were conducted under the assumption that the peoples who built the great houses and the cliff dwellings were more advanced, more sophisticated than the contemporary Pueblo peoples who claimed descent from them, and that therefore the relationship between the ancient builders and the modern communities was not as direct or as significant as those communities claimed. This assumption, which was never well supported by evidence and which has been thoroughly overturned by subsequent research, was motivated in part by the desire to study the ancient sites without being accountable to the contemporary communities most closely connected to them. If Chaco Canyon was built by an extinct or unknowable people, you could excavate it however you liked without worrying about what the Pueblo communities thought about your methods. If Pueblo Bonito's connection to the contemporary Pueblo people was dismissed as speculative or sentimental, you could remove the human remains found there to a museum in Washington without asking permission of anyone whose relationship to those remains was more than academic. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 changed the legal framework, but it did not immediately change the practices built on the old assumptions. Museums and universities that had spent decades accumulating indigenous human remains and sacred objects had institutional and financial reasons to interpret the law's requirements as narrowly as possible, to move slowly on repatriation claims, to apply procedural requirements that made it as difficult as possible for communities to recover what the law said belonged to them. The ongoing struggles over repatriation at major American research institutions reflect not just bureaucratic inertia, but the persistent influence of the old assumption that the study of indigenous heritage was properly the domain of academic institutions, rather than of the communities that produced that heritage. The linguistic map of the Southwest is itself a history, and it is a history that the standard account has almost completely ignored. The languages spoken in the Southwest at the time of Spanish contact were not primitive or simple. Hopi belongs to the Uto-Aztecan language family, which connects it to languages spoken as far south as central Mexico, including the language of the Aztec Empire. Zuni is a language isolate, meaning it has no demonstrated relationship to any other language family, a situation analogous to the Basque language of Spain and France, and one that raises fascinating questions about the deep history of who was in the Southwest and when. Navajo and the Apache languages belong to the Athabascan family, which includes languages spoken in Alaska and northwestern Canada, reflecting the southern migration of Athabascan-speaking peoples that brought the ancestors of the Navajo and Apache to the Southwest relatively recently in geological time, probably within the last 1,000 to 1,500 years. The Keresan languages, spoken by several Pueblo communities including Acoma, Cochiti, Santa Ana, and Zia, are another language isolate family, unrelated to any other known language group, and therefore carrying no clear evidence of where their speakers came from before they arrived in the Rio Grande Valley. The Tanoan languages, which include Tewa, Tiwa, and Toa, are a family of related languages spoken across many of the eastern Pueblo communities, and their relationships to each other and to other North American language families are subjects of ongoing linguistic research. This linguistic diversity, multiple language families and multiple language isolates concentrated in a relatively small geographic area, is the signature of an ancient and complicated human history in the region. It suggests that the Southwest was reached by multiple distinct populations at different times, that those populations developed in relative isolation from each other long enough to produce genuinely distinct languages, and that by the time the record becomes legible through archaeology and oral tradition, the linguistic landscape was already ancient and already complex. The oral traditions of the Pueblo communities carry memories that researchers are increasingly able to correlate with archaeological and geological evidence, and those correlations are revealing a depth of indigenous historical knowledge that the standard account has never taken seriously. Hopi oral tradition, for instance, describes a series of world catastrophes and migrations that connect to specific places in the archaeological record. The traditions of movement, of communities forming and reforming over generations, of the specific places where the people stopped and the reasons they moved on, correspond to what the archaeological evidence shows about the settlement patterns of the ancestral Puebloans over the centuries before Spanish contact. The oral tradition is not simply a distorted memory of historical events translated into mythological language. It is a different kind of historical record, one that preserves information through different mechanisms than written documents, that prioritizes different kinds of knowledge, and that connects the past to the present in ways that written history typically does not. When a Hopi elder tells the story of Palatquapi, the mythological city to the south that the people left. And when archaeologists identify sites in southern Arizona and northern Mexico that match the description of Palaquapi with remarkable precision, the encounter between oral tradition and archaeology is producing historical knowledge that neither discipline could produce alone. This kind of collaborative historical research, combining the oral traditions of indigenous communities with the material evidence of archaeology and the documentary evidence of colonial records, is producing a far richer and more accurate picture of Southwestern history than any single approach could generate. But it requires a level of respect for indigenous knowledge as genuine historical knowledge, rather than as interesting folklore to be checked against the real evidence, that the standard academic approach has been slow to develop, and that the textbook version of history has never begun to reflect. The food systems of the Southwest are another area where indigenous knowledge has been recognized as genuinely important only very recently, and where the standard historical account has done considerable damage by treating indigenous agricultural practices as primitive precursors to the scientific agriculture that European settlers introduced. The corn varieties developed by indigenous farmers in the Southwest over thousands of years represent one of the most sophisticated examples of plant breeding in human history. The desert-adapted corn varieties of the Hopi, the Navajo, and the Pueblo communities were developed through generations of careful selection to germinate and grow under conditions of extreme aridity, to send roots deeper than conventional corn varieties, to resist the specific pests and diseases of the desert environment, and to produce reliable yields in years with minimal rainfall. These varieties were not developed in a greenhouse or a laboratory. They were developed in desert fields, through the accumulated observations and selections of farmers across centuries, and they encode in their genetics an enormous amount of knowledge about how to grow food in an arid environment that has taken modern plant scientists decades to begin to appreciate. The Three Sisters agricultural system, the companion planting of corn, beans, and squash that was practiced across the Southwest and much of North America before European contact, is another example of indigenous agricultural sophistication that is only now being recognized in mainstream agricultural science. The Three Sisters system takes advantage of the complementary nutritional relationships between the three plants, their different root depths, their different light requirements, and the nitrogen-fixing capacity of the beans to create a highly productive, self-sustaining polyculture that produces better yields in marginal conditions than any of the three plants grown in monoculture. This is not primitive farming. This is sophisticated ecological design that took generations to develop, and that modern agroecology is now trying to understand and replicate. The preservation of these varieties and these practices through the colonial period and into the present is another form of cultural continuity that deserves recognition as a historical achievement. The Spanish colonial system disrupted indigenous agriculture in many ways, imposing new crops and new animals, redirecting labor from indigenous agricultural systems to colonial agricultural production, and in some cases physically preventing indigenous communities from accessing the land they needed to maintain their own food systems. That Hopi blue corn and Navajo churro sheep and Pueblo Chile varieties survived through all of this is not incidental. It reflects deliberate choices to maintain traditional food systems alongside or underneath the colonial economy. Choices that involved real costs and required real commitment. The slow food movement has recognized this, and the Heritage Food Plants Alliance and similar organizations have worked with indigenous communities in the Southwest to document and preserve traditional crop varieties that were at risk of being lost. But the recognition is still limited relative to the significance of what has been preserved, and the economic conditions of many indigenous farming communities make the maintenance of traditional agriculture an ongoing struggle rather than a settled achievement. Let's close now by circling back to something we began with. The question of what the Southwest actually is, whose history it carries, whose story it tells. The standard account answers this question in a particular way. It tells a story that begins with indigenous peoples as background, then moves through the Spanish period and the Mexican period and the American period, with each transition marking an advance toward the present, with the present representing, implicitly, the outcome toward which all the preceding history was moving. In this story, the American Southwest is a region that became part of the United States through a historical process that, while imperfect, produced something worthwhile and something that is now simply a given, a fact about the world that does not require ongoing justification or accountability. The honest account answers the question differently. It tells a story in which the American Southwest is a landscape with a long and complicated human history, most of which predates European contact, and in which the current political and social reality is not simply the natural outcome of historical processes, but is specifically produced by specific policy decisions, specific legal arrangements, specific economic structures, and specific acts of violence and dispossession that have never been fully acknowledged, fully accounted for, or fully addressed. These two accounts are not simply different emphases on the same facts. They produce genuinely different understandings of what the Southwest is, what obligations its history creates, and what an honest reckoning with that history would require. The standard account produces a population that looks at the landscape and sees a region with an interesting historical past that has been overcome and left behind. The honest account produces a population that looks at the same landscape and sees an ongoing situation, one in which the choices made in the past continue to produce the conditions of the present, and in which the question of what those conditions should be is still open. The difference between those two ways of seeing has practical consequences. It shapes how you think about water policy in an arid region facing intensifying drought. It shapes how you think about the management of federal lands that carry both cultural heritage value and extractive resource potential. It shapes how you think about the legal rights of tribal nations and the obligations of the federal government under its treaty commitments. It shapes how you think about the design of public institutions, schools and health systems, and economic development programs that serve communities whose history is very different from the history you probably learned in school. None of this requires guilt as an ongoing emotional state. Guilt is not particularly useful as a driver of policy or of historical understanding. What is useful is accuracy. Accurate understanding of what happened. Accurate understanding of the causal connections between what happened and what exists now. Accurate understanding of what the legal and moral obligations of the current system are toward the people most directly affected by its history. These are achievable, and they produce more just and more functional outcomes than the misunderstanding they replace. The Southwest is one of the most visually spectacular regions of North America. The light on the red rock country at dawn is something that stops people in their tracks. The high desert sky on a clear night, with the stars bright enough to cast shadows, connects you to something that feels genuinely ancient. The ruins of Chaco Canyon, standing in their particular silence in a landscape that seems to have been designed for contemplation, produce in most visitors a sense of encounter with something genuinely important. What most visitors to these places carry with them is the standard account, the version that tells them they are encountering the prehistoric, the ancient, the long gone. What the honest account would give them instead is a sense of standing in a landscape that is still alive with the history that produced it, where the people who built the great houses are represented by living communities that are still here, where the water that the Hohokam channeled is still being contested in federal court, where the ceremonies that the Franciscans tried to suppress are being performed in kivas across the Rio Grande Valley, where the roads that Coronado traveled are still roads, where the mountains that the Navajo call their sacred boundaries are still the boundaries of a living world. That is a more interesting and a more accurate thing to be encountering than the version the textbook gives you. It is also a more demanding thing, because it does not permit you to see the landscape as simply beautiful and leave it at that. It asks you to see it as inhabited, as contested, as carrying an ongoing story rather than a concluded one. It asks you to understand that the people who live in it now are the inheritors of everything this account has described, and that their lives and their conditions and their futures are continuous, with a history that deserves to be told honestly. The version in the textbooks is a lie, as this account's title promised, but it is not a lie in the simple sense of being a deliberate fabrication. It is a lie in the deeper sense of being organized to conceal rather than to reveal, to comfort rather than to challenge, to produce a specific and convenient understanding of the past rather than an accurate one. Recognizing a lie of that kind, understanding how it works and what it does, is the first step towards something more honest. And something more honest is available, built from the same landscape and the same evidence and the same communities, if you are willing to look at them with eyes that are not already committed to seeing only part of what is there. The people of Taos Pueblo are still in their 1,000-year-old building. The water of the Rio Grande is still flowing south through a valley that has been farmed for 2,000 years. The Milky Way is still visible from the high desert on a clear night. The same band of light that ancestral Puebloan astronomers tracked and encoded in the alignments of their great houses. The stars that Coronado's soldiers navigated by are the same stars that the descendants of the people they encountered navigate by now. The landscape holds all of it. The full history, the long history, the honest history. You just have to be willing to read it. There is a practice in some Pueblo communities of telling certain stories only at certain times of year, only in certain contexts, only to people who are prepared to receive them. The principle behind this practice is that knowledge is not neutral, that stories carry weight, and that the weight of a story is something that needs to be handled carefully by people who understand what they are receiving and who are prepared to carry it responsibly. The history of the Southwest is that kind of story. It is not a neutral account of things that happened long ago to people who are no longer here. It is a living history, connected to living communities, with living consequences, and the weight of it is real. Carrying it responsibly means not just knowing the facts, but understanding the connections, understanding what the facts imply about the present, and about what an honest and just response to the present would look like. That is the history you were not taught. That is the history that the textbook version was organized to prevent you from knowing. And that is the history that is available, patient and complete, and more interesting than the version you were given, waiting for you in the landscape of the American Southwest, if you are willing to look for it with honesty rather than with the comfortable assumptions that the standard account installed in your head before you were old enough to question them. The Rio Grande is still running. The mesa is still there. The building at Taos is still standing. Go find the real story. It was never lost. It was just not in the chapter you were assigned. If you have been listening to this for a while now, if the words have been carrying you through the hours, then you have spent some time with a history that most people never encounter. That matters. Not because knowledge alone changes anything, but because the kind of honest attention that history like this requires is itself a practice, a way of relating to the world that, once developed, tends to expand outward into other things. The Southwest that this account has tried to describe is a real place, and its history is a real history, and the communities whose story it tells are real communities with real lives and real ongoing struggles and real ongoing achievements. If you want to know more, the starting point is not a textbook. It is the scholarship of Indigenous historians and archaeologists and anthropologists who have been building the more complete and more accurate account for decades. The oral traditions and the community archives that carry knowledge no outside researcher will ever fully reach, and the direct engagement with the communities themselves, whose own accounts of their own history are the most authoritative available. The Pueblo of Acoma runs its own cultural programs. The Navajo Nation has its own educational institutions. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office works to document and protect Hopi heritage. The Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque is a genuinely good introduction to the Pueblo world. These are places where the honest account is being maintained and transmitted, and they are more reliable guides to the actual history than anything the standard curriculum offers. As you drift towards sleep, or wherever you are in the arc of your listening, let the landscape of the Southwest settle in your mind. The red rock and the blue sky and the adobe walls and the running water and the night stars and the ancient roads and the living ceremonies and the languages that are still being spoken and the buildings that are still being lived in and the corn that is still being planted in the desert and the fights that are still being fought in the courts and the songs that are still being sung in the kivas. That is the Southwest. All of it, Not the postcard version, not the textbook version, but the full version, which is stranger and older and more alive and more demanding and more worth knowing than anything the standard account has ever managed to convey. The story does not end. It is still happening, and whether you are near that landscape or far from it, you are connected to it, because it is part of the history of the country and the continent that produced the world you are living in. And the choices made in it over the past 500 years are choices you are still living with the consequences of, whether you know it or not. Now you know a little more. The rest is what you do with it. There is an archive in Seville, Spain, called the Archivo General de Indias, the General Archive of the Indies. It was established in 1785 to centralize the documents produced by the Spanish colonial administration across all of its American territories, and it holds approximately 43,000 bundles of documents, 80 million pages of text covering 3 centuries of Spanish colonial history in the Americas. Every report, every census, every judicial proceeding, every land survey, every expedition account, every letter from governors to viceroys to the crown, everything that the Spanish bureaucracy produced about its colonial territories is in that archive, including everything about New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and California. The archive is not secret. It has been accessible to researchers for 200 years. Scholars have spent careers in it, emerging with material that rewrites what we know about specific episodes and specific communities and specific decisions made in the colonial period. The information is there. It has always been there. The question of why it has not made it into the standard historical account is not a question about the availability of evidence. It is a question about the choices made in deciding what evidence to present to the public and in what form. Some of what the archive contains is genuinely difficult material. The records of the encomienda system, which document the specific tribute demands imposed on specific Pueblo communities in specific years, are not comfortable reading. They are accountings of human exploitation, and they are specific and detailed in the way that bureaucratic records tend to be. The name of the Pueblo, the number of blankets required, the number of labor days demanded, the name of the encomendero to whom the tribute was due. Not abstract systems, but specific transactions, specific impositions on specific people. The records of the Inquisition in New Mexico, which investigated not only indigenous people accused of heresy, but also colonists accused of a remarkable range of offenses, including bigamy, blasphemy, and various forms of unorthodoxy, give a view into the internal social life of the colonial community that is both more complex and more humanly recognizable than the standard account allows. The colonists of New Mexico were not a monolithic group of civilizing heroes. They were a mixed population of soldiers, settlers, merchants, mixed heritage families, former servants of various indigenous backgrounds, and friars with conflicting institutional loyalties, all living in difficult conditions under administrative arrangements that pleased almost no one. The Inquisition records are full of people denouncing each other, of complicated domestic situations, of spiritual anxieties and social tensions, and the kind of messy human reality that official history always tends to smooth over. The records of the Pueblo Revolt are among the most extraordinary documents in the archive. In the aftermath of the revolt, when the Spanish had retreated to El Paso del Norte and were trying to understand what had happened, they took extensive depositions from Pueblo, people who came forward voluntarily or who were captured, and those depositions contained descriptions of the revolt from the perspective of people who participated in it. This is unusual in colonial historical records, which almost never preserve indigenous voices in any direct way. The depositions are filtered through Spanish interpreters and recorded in Spanish legal formulae. But underneath those filters you can sometimes hear a different voice, the voice of someone describing events they lived through from the inside. One of the most striking passages in these records is the description given by Catua and Umtua, 2 Tewa men who were deposed by the Spanish at Isleta Pueblo in September 1680, just weeks after the revolt. They describe the role of Pope in organizing the uprising, his travels from Pueblo to Pueblo, the coded message of the knotted cord, the decision to move the date up when the plan was discovered, They described the specific events at specific communities. They described the destruction of the churches and the recovery of the traditional ceremonies. And embedded in their account is a detail that does not make it into any textbook treatment of the revolt, which is Pope's message to the Pueblo communities about why the revolt was necessary. According to these accounts, Pope told the people that the time had come to abandon the customs of the Spanish and to return to what their ancestors had done before the Spanish arrived, and that those who did not comply would be punished. This message is significant not just for its content, but for what it reveals about how Pope understood the revolt. He understood it not merely as a political act, a change of governance, but as a cultural restoration, an assertion that the identity and practices that the Spanish colonial system had spent 80 years trying to eliminate were not just permissible, but mandatory. The revolt was, in his framing, an act of cultural as much as political self-determination. That framing has been picked up by contemporary Pueblo communities, by scholars of colonial history, and by the official recognition of Pope in the National Statuary Hall. It has not made it into the standard textbook account, because the standard account does not have the conceptual framework to accommodate a revolt organized around cultural restoration as a legitimate historical event. The demographic records in the Colonial archive tell another story that is worth extracting from the academic literature where it lives and putting where it belongs, which is at the center of any honest account of what the Spanish colonial period meant for the indigenous peoples of the Southwest. The missionary reports that friars submitted annually to their superiors are among the most systematically organized records in the archive. Each report contains, among other things, a count of the population of the community served by that mission, a record of baptisms and deaths, and often a description of the material and spiritual condition of the community. When these records are assembled into a continuous series across the 17th century, the picture they paint is devastating. The population counts decline steadily, and in some years precipitously. The death records consistently outnumber the birth records in mission communities. The missionaries themselves sometimes noted the declining population in terms that suggest they understood, if dimly, that something was wrong with the system they were administering, though their proposed remedies were invariably more missionary effort rather than less colonial exploitation. The gap between the reported population in the 1601 census and the reported population in the reports of the 1670s is somewhere between half and two-thirds of the total. The Pueblo population that had been counted at approximately 60,000 in 1601 had fallen to somewhere between 17 and 25,000 by 1680. That loss, across 80 years, represents not just a statistical decline, it represents the deaths of tens of thousands of individual human beings, people with names and families and histories, who died of diseases that the colonial system made them more susceptible to, of starvation produced by tribute demands that took food from communities that needed it, of the violence of colonial administration, and of the accumulated effects of coercive labor, inadequate nutrition, and the destruction of the social systems that had previously organized community health and welfare. This is the actual record of the Spanish colonial period in New Mexico, and it lives in a building in Seville that has been open to researchers for 200 years. The decision not to put this record in the textbook is not a decision made by the archive. It is a decision made by the people who write the history, and it is a decision that has been made consistently and repeatedly across the entire history of American historical education, which is itself a record worth examining. The academic field of borderlands history, which developed significantly from the work of Herbert Eugene Bolton in the early 20th century, and which has been transformed by the work of scholars like David Weber, Ramon Gutierrez, John McFarriger, Ned Blackhawk, and Pekka Hämäläinen over the past several decades, has produced a substantially more accurate and more complete account of the Southwest than anything that has made it into standard curricula. These scholars have taken the Spanish colonial records seriously, have incorporated indigenous oral traditions and archaeological evidence, and have built a picture of the Southwest as a genuinely complex human landscape, rather than as a backdrop for a story of American national destiny. Ned Blackhawk's work on the violence of the Great Basin and the Southwest, and Pekka Hämäläinen's work on Comanche and Lakota empire building have been particularly important in recovering the indigenous perspective on colonial history in ways that the standard account has never managed. Blackhawk's argument that violence was not incidental to the colonial encounter in the West, but was its constitutive condition, the thing that made the colonial project possible, is a challenge to the comfortable narrative of exploration and settlement that deserves to be read widely. Hämäläinen's demonstration that the Comanche were not simply reacting to American and Spanish expansion, but were themselves building an empire that shaped the entire history of the Southern Plains, that the Comanche Empire was a genuine historical force comparable in its scope and sophistication to any European colonial power, is a revision of the standard account so significant that it is hard to overstate its implications for how we understand the Southwest. These books exist. The scholarship exists. The historical record in the archives of Seville and Mexico City and the regional archives in Santa Fe and Austin exists. The oral traditions of the Pueblo, Navajo, Hopi, Apache, and other communities exist. The archaeological record exists, increasingly accessible through remote sensing and isotopic analysis and ancient DNA techniques that are producing new information faster than the interpretive literature can keep up with. The honest account is not waiting to be constructed. It has already been constructed. It just has not been put in the place where most people encounter history, which is in the classroom, in the approved textbooks, in the curriculum standards that determine what gets taught and what does not. The path from the scholarly literature to the classroom is long and contested, and there are powerful interests with stakes in maintaining the standard account. Textbook publishing is a market, and markets respond to demand, and the demand is shaped by curriculum standards, which are set by state boards of education, which are populated by people who hold a wide range of views about what history education is for and what it should contain. In states like Texas, which is the largest single market for textbook purchases in the country, and which therefore has outsized influence on what goes into textbooks used nationwide, the political process of setting curriculum standards has been a site of significant conflict over exactly these questions. The Texas State Board of Education's curriculum controversies of 2010, when the board made a series of decisions about what would be included and excluded in the state's social studies standards, produced substantial national attention, partly because the Texas standards influence not just Texas classrooms, but classrooms across the country through the publishing market. The revisions made in those debates involved decisions about how to characterize the founding of the country, about the relative prominence given to various historical figures, and about the framing of events like the Civil Rights Movement. They did not substantially improve the treatment of Southwestern indigenous history, which remained in the standard form of a brief introduction before the Spanish arrival, and then essentially no presence thereafter. The argument made by those who resist expanding the treatment of indigenous history in curricula is sometimes about time, that there is only so much space in a curriculum and priorities have to be made, and that the history of the United States as a political and economic entity is the appropriate focus of American history education. This argument would be more convincing if the history of the United States as a political and economic entity could actually be understood without understanding the history of the indigenous peoples whose land was taken to create that entity and whose labor and resources contributed to its development. In fact, you cannot understand the history of the American Southwest without understanding indigenous history, because indigenous history is not a separate subject but the foundation on which every other dimension of Southwestern history rests. The argument made by others is more explicitly political, that emphasizing the violence and dispossession of colonial history is unpatriotic, that it produces negative attitudes toward the country's heritage, that it focuses on the worst aspects of the past rather than on the achievements. This argument assumes a particular definition of patriotism that equates it with uncritical celebration of the national narrative, and it assumes that acknowledging historical wrongdoing is incompatible with genuine appreciation of what is valuable in a country's history. Both assumptions are worth challenging, A patriotism that requires ignorance of what actually happened is a fragile thing, and a more honest understanding of history that includes both the achievements and the failures tends to produce a more sophisticated and more durable form of civic engagement than one built on a carefully curated myth. The communities that have survived the history this account has described have done so, in part, through the maintenance of their own historical consciousness. The Pueblo communities have not forgotten the Pueblo Revolt. They have not forgotten the 1675 persecution or the Acoma massacre or the labor demands of the encomienda system. They have maintained those memories in oral tradition, in ceremony, in the physical continuity of their communities and their buildings and their agricultural practices. That memory has been a source of cultural and political coherence across 5 centuries of external pressure. The concept of memory as a form of resistance is worth pausing on, because it is something that the standard account does not know how to accommodate. Memory, in the standard account of history, is what produces nostalgia, sentiment, the backward-looking attachment to a past that progress has superseded. Memory in the indigenous historical tradition is something different, a living connection to a past that is not superseded but continuous, a source of identity and orientation in the present, a record of what the community has survived and how it has survived it. When Pueblo elders describe the Pueblo Revolt not as a historical event but as part of the community's ongoing story, they are not being imprecise or sentimental. They are describing a different relationship to time and to historical consciousness, one in which the past is not separated from the present by an epistemological gap, but is continuous with it, one in which the story of who you are includes the story of what your people have endured and what they have chosen to do about it. That different relationship to historical consciousness is itself a form of knowledge, and it is knowledge that the Western academic tradition has been slow to recognize as such. The ceremonial calendar of the Pueblo communities is one of the most visible expressions of this continuous relationship to the past. The annual cycle of ceremonies, which involves the entire community and practices that have been maintained across hundreds of years of colonial pressure, is not just a religious or cultural practice. It is also a historical practice, a continuous reenactment of the community's relationship to the landscape, to the natural world, to the ancestors, and to the spiritual forces that the community understands as organizing the world. The ceremonies are history and performance, a form of living historical transmission that carries knowledge and memory in ways that no archive can replicate. When the Spanish missionaries tried to suppress these ceremonies in the 17th century, they were not just attacking religious practice in the narrow sense. They were attacking the primary mechanism through which indigenous communities transmitted historical knowledge, cultural identity, and the social practices that maintained community cohesion. The suppression of ceremony was an attack on historical memory, and the persistence of ceremony through the colonial period, in secret when necessary, openly when possible, was not just a religious act but a historical act, an insistence on maintaining the capacity to remember who you were and where you came from. The contemporary relevance of all of this is not difficult to trace. The debates about how to teach history, about whose history counts, about what the obligations of the present to the past are, these debates are not abstract academic exercises. They are debates about power, about whose experience is centered in public institutions, about whose identity is reflected in public spaces, about whose history is treated as important enough to deserve serious attention and preservation. The movement to remove Confederate monuments from public spaces, which produced considerable national debate in the second decade of the 21st century, was at its core a debate about whose history is being commemorated in spaces that belong to everyone and whose experience of that history is being validated by the commemoration. The parallel debate about indigenous historical representation, about why Coronado has a highway named after him and Pope spent 300 years in relative obscurity before being placed in the National Statuary Hall, is a debate about the same fundamental questions. The choices about public commemoration encode assumptions about which histories matter and which do not, and those assumptions have consequences for how people in the present understand their own relationship to the past. The place names of the Southwest are another form of public commemoration that encodes a specific historical perspective. The city of Albuquerque is named for the Duke of Albuquerque, a Spanish viceroy. The city of Santa Fe is named for the Holy Faith, a Spanish Catholic construct. The city of Tucson takes its name from a Spanish rendering of the Odom name, Cook Son, which describes a certain kind of dark spring at the base of a mountain. The city of Taos takes its name from the Spanish rendering of the Tiwa word for the pueblo there, which in Tiwa is Tuatá, meaning our village. The state of Arizona takes its name from a Spanish rendering of the Odom word Ali Shonak, meaning small spring. The state of New Mexico, of course, took its name from Mexico, which in turn took it from the Mexica, the indigenous Nahuatl-speaking people of central Mexico whose empire the Spanish conquered. These naming histories are not trivial. They are a record of which languages have been treated as worth preserving in the landscape's nomenclature, and which have been treated as raw material for Spanish or English appropriation. In some cases, indigenous names survive in Spanish or English disguise, their origins forgotten or never known by the people using them. In other cases, indigenous names were simply replaced, the landscape renamed after Spanish royalty and Catholic saints and American political figures, the original names surviving only in the memories of the communities that had always used them. The recovery of indigenous place names is part of the broader project of recovering the indigenous history of the Southwest, and it is happening, slowly, in parallel with the recovery of that history in the academic literature and in the public sphere. The Navajo name for the Grand Canyon, Bidar, meaning the canyon, is starting to appear alongside the English name in some contexts. The Odom names for places within Odom territory are being restored to maps and to signage. The Hopi names for the mesas and springs and fields that have been Hopi since before Spanish contact are being maintained in Hopi educational programs and transmitted to new generations. None of this is simply symbolic. Place names carry history. When you use the name a community has always used for a place, you are acknowledging that community's relationship to that place, its prior presence there, its ongoing connection. When you replace an indigenous name with a Spanish or English one, you are performing, in the small scale of linguistic choice, the same substitution that colonialism performed in the large scale of political and economic organization, a substitution of the colonizer's presence for the colonized's presence, a making invisible of the people who were there first. The recovery of indigenous place names, then, is a recovery of indigenous historical visibility, a small but not insignificant step in the larger project of correcting the standard account and replacing it with something that reflects what actually happened and who actually lived and continues to live in this landscape. The Santa Fe Trail, which we mentioned earlier in a different context, runs through a landscape whose full history it does not tell. The trail connected Missouri to Santa Fe along a route that crossed the southern plains, entering New Mexico through the Raton Pass or the Cimarron Cutoff. The commerce it carried transformed the economy of New Mexico and connected it to the growing American market. The people who traveled it were traders and adventurers and settlers, and the trail itself is celebrated in roadside monuments and museum exhibits across the states it crosses. What the commemoration of the Santa Fe Trail almost never mentions is that the trail crossed the hunting grounds of the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, and the Cheyenne, and that the expansion of American commerce along the trail was part of the process by which those peoples were dispossessed of their territory. The trail was not merely a trade route. It was an advancing front of American economic expansion, and the political and military decisions that secured it, that made it safe for American commerce, were decisions that removed indigenous authority over the landscape it crossed. The wagons rolled, the commerce flowed, and the people whose land it crossed were progressively pushed aside, confined to reservations, and ultimately subjected to the same policies of cultural destruction that we have been describing throughout this account. The Comanche, who controlled so much of the southern plains and so significantly shaped the history of the Spanish and Mexican Southwest, were defeated not primarily by military defeat in battle, but by the destruction of the bison herds. the systematic killing of the bison by commercial hunters in the 1870s and 1880s, which was tacitly supported by the United States military as a way to undermine Comanche economic and military power, eliminated the resource base on which the Comanche economy depended. Without the bison, the Comanche could not sustain the horse culture that had made them the dominant power on the southern plains. Without the horse culture, the political and military organization that had challenged Spain and Mexico and the early American frontier collapsed. The Comanche were not defeated in any conventional military sense. They were starved out of their power, and the instrument of their starvation was the commercial exploitation of the natural resources that sustained them. This pattern of using resource destruction as a form of indigenous subjugation is one that repeats across the history of the Southwest. The destruction of the peach orchards in Canyon de Chelly during the Kit Carson campaign, the destruction of the bison on the southern plains, the depletion of groundwater on the Navajo aquifer by coal mining, the contamination of water sources by uranium mining. In each case, the resource that sustains a community is targeted and destroyed as a mechanism of bringing that community under the authority of the colonizing power, and in each case, the standard account treats the resource destruction as incidental rather than intentional, as a regrettable side effect of historical progress rather than as a deliberate strategy of subjugation. Recognizing the pattern is important not just for understanding the past, but for understanding the present. When water rights in the Colorado River Basin are being allocated without adequate consideration of indigenous water rights, you are watching a version of the same pattern operate in a contemporary form. The resource that sustains indigenous communities being made available to others on terms that the indigenous communities did not set and did not agree to. When energy development on or near indigenous lands proceeds with inadequate environmental review and inadequate consultation with affected communities, you are watching the same pattern. The mechanism is different, and the formal legal framework is different, but the underlying dynamic, the treatment of indigenous resource rights as subordinate to the demands of the broader economy, is consistent from the 16th century to the 21st. Understanding this continuity is not an argument for paralysis or for treating every present-day conflict as simply a continuation of past wrongs with no possibility of resolution. It is an argument for seeing present-day conflicts clearly, for understanding what they are actually about, and for approaching their resolution with a genuine rather than a merely nominal commitment to the legal rights and the human interests of the communities most affected. The water settlements that have been negotiated in the Southwest over the past several decades, in which tribal nations have reached agreements with federal, state, and local governments about the quantification and delivery of their water rights, are examples of what genuine engagement with these issues can produce. They are imperfect, as any negotiated settlement is imperfect. They do not fully compensate for what was taken. They do not restore the pre-colonial water situation, which no settlement could, but they do represent an acknowledgement that the rights exist and a commitment to honoring them in some meaningful form. They represent, in the domain of water policy, what the honest account of history represents in the domain of knowledge, an imperfect but real step toward a more accurate and more just relationship with what actually happened. The generation of indigenous scholars, artists, lawyers, and community leaders who have been building this more honest account in the courts and in the academy and in the galleries and in the community programs and in the tribal colleges and in the policy documents and in the oral traditions that they carry and transmit represents one of the most significant intellectual and cultural developments in the American Southwest in the last half-century. They are producing the scholarship, the art, the legal arguments, and the political strategies that are, slowly and not without setbacks, moving the reality of the Southwest towards something that better reflects the full history of the place. Their work deserves to be known and supported by the broader public, not out of guilt or charity, but out of genuine recognition that the honest account they are building is better history than the standard account, more accurate, more complete, more useful for understanding where we are and how we got here, and more respectful of the full complexity of the human experience in this landscape. The Southwest is a magnificent place, in the deepest and most accurate sense of the word, not just visually spectacular, though it is that, but genuinely extraordinary. A landscape whose human history is as old as human presence on the continent, whose cultures are as sophisticated as any the world has produced, whose people have endured as much as any people anywhere have endured and have maintained their identity and their connection to the land through that endurance. That is worth knowing. That is worth teaching. That is worth carrying into the future as the foundation for a more honest and more just relationship between the country that now calls this landscape its own and the communities who have always called it home. The next time you stand anywhere in this landscape, whether you are in the red rock country of Utah, or the high desert of New Mexico, or the Sonoran desert of Arizona, or the piney mountains of Colorado, stand for a moment with the full history in mind. The 1,000 years before Spain arrived, the 80 years of colonial violence and cultural suppression before the Pueblo Revolt, the 12 years of freedom, the reconquest and the negotiated accommodation, the long walk and the rebuilding, the boarding schools and the resistance to them, the water rights and the uranium and the coal, the ceremonies that kept being performed, the languages that kept being spoken, the corn that kept being planted in the desert. All of that is in the landscape under your feet and in the air around you. The standard account does not give you access to it, but the honest account, the one you have been hearing in this long telling, does. And once you have access to it, once you can see the full history rather than the version that was selected and arranged to produce a particular kind of comfortable ignorance, the landscape becomes something different than it was before. Not less beautiful, not more guilty, just more real, more fully itself, more fully a place where human beings have lived and struggled and made meaning for a very long time, and where they are still doing so now, and where the story is still being written, and where what gets written in it next depends, in part, on what those of us who are not part of the oldest chapters choose to understand and to do with what we understand. That is what the textbook version of history is not able to give you. That is what the honest account can, and that is why it matters to seek it out, to sit with it, to let it settle into you as you are settling into sleep, carrying forward into whatever morning comes a slightly more accurate sense of the place you are in and the long, complicated, still unfinished story you are part of. There is one more dimension of this history that deserves careful attention before we close, and it is the dimension that perhaps most directly connects the past to the present in ways that are visible and immediate rather than requiring historical reconstruction. It is the dimension of language, and specifically of what happens to a people when the language they have carried for thousands of years is threatened with extinction. The indigenous languages of the Southwest are not simply communication systems. They are knowledge repositories, encoding in their grammar and vocabulary, and in the stories and ceremonies that are expressed through them, a kind of knowledge about the landscape, about the natural world, about the relationships between human communities and the other beings they share the world with, that has no precise equivalent in English or Spanish. When a language is lost, what is lost with it is not just a set of words and grammatical structures, but an entire way of organizing the world, an entire tradition of observation and description and relationship that took thousands of years to develop. The Hopi language, to take a specific example, has a relationship to time that is fundamentally different from the English relationship to time. The Hopi language does not have tenses in the English sense, does not divide time into past, present, and future in the same way. This is not because the Hopi are unable to distinguish between past, present, and future events. It is because the Hopi linguistic tradition organizes temporal experience differently, in ways that some linguists and philosophers have argued produce a fundamentally different relationship to time, to causation, to the nature of events and their relationship to one another. Whether or not you accept the strongest versions of this claim, the Hopi linguistic tradition's different relationship to time is visible in the ceremonial calendar, in the way that ceremonial preparations that must happen months in advance of a ceremony are understood as already part of the ceremony rather than as preparations for it, in the way that the actions of the ancestors are understood as still happening rather than as having happened in a completed past. This relationship to time, expressed in and through the Hopi language, is not a quaint cultural curiosity. It is a sophisticated philosophical framework that has organized Hopi life for a very long time, and that continues to organize it for the Hopi people who maintain it. Losing that language would not just mean losing the words. It would mean losing the framework. It would mean losing access to the way of understanding the world that the language embodies, and that the ceremonies and stories and daily life practices organized around the language express. The people who speak Hopi would still be here, but something essential to their relationship to their own history and their own landscape would be gone. The Navajo language, Diné Bizard, is one of the great linguistic achievements of human history. Its complexity, its tonal structure, its system of verb stems that encode extraordinarily precise information about the shape and movement and position of objects, its vast vocabulary for landscape features and natural phenomena and social relationships. These reflect thousands of years of intellectual development by a people who paid exquisitely close attention to the world they lived in. The Navajo code talkers of World War II, who used Diné Bizard as the basis for a military code that the Japanese were never able to break, demonstrated in the most dramatic possible public context the sophistication of the language and the adaptability of its speakers. The boarding school system attacked Navajo, along with every other indigenous language, with deliberate intensity. Children who spoke Navajo in school were punished. The explicit goal was to eliminate the language from the next generation, to produce a generation of Navajo people who could not communicate with their elders except through English, who were cut off from the oral tradition that the language carried, who were in the most fundamental sense alienated from their own history. The program did not succeed entirely, but it did serious damage, and the Navajo language today, while more robust than many indigenous languages in North America, faces the same pressures that all minority languages face in a world dominated by English language media, education, and economic life. The Navajo Nation has invested significantly in language revitalization programs, in immersion schools where young children spend their school days learning in Diné Bizard, in radio and television programming in the language, in curriculum development that brings Navajo language and culture into schools that have historically used only English. These programs are producing results. There are young Navajo people today who speak the language fluently and who are choosing to use it, to teach it to their children, to produce art and music and literature in it, to use it in governance and in public life. The language is not dying. It is struggling, and it is being fought for, and the fight is being waged by people who understand what is at stake. The same struggle is being waged for Hopi, for Zuni, for the Tiwa and Tewa and Toa languages of the Pueblo communities, for the various Apache languages, for the O'odham language of southern Arizona. Each of these languages has a community of speakers working to maintain it and to transmit it to the next generation against the current of a world in which economic survival tends to require English, and in which the dominant culture surrounds indigenous communities with English language media, commerce, and social interaction at every turn. The connection between language survival and cultural survival is not merely symbolic. When a community maintains its language, it maintains the living transmission of the knowledge encoded in that language, the stories and ceremonies and practical knowledge of the landscape that the language carries. When a language is lost, the knowledge it carries does not automatically transfer into the replacement language. Some of it can be translated, much of it cannot. Not because it is untranslatable in principle, but because translation requires a community of people who understand both languages and the knowledge traditions organized around both. And maintaining that kind of deep bilingualism across generations is extraordinarily difficult under the pressures that indigenous communities face. This is why language revitalization is not a peripheral or sentimental concern, but a central one for any honest assessment of what has been done to indigenous communities and what genuine reckoning with that history would require. If the goal of the boarding school system was to eliminate indigenous languages and thereby eliminate the cultural and historical consciousness that those languages carried, then the preservation and revitalization of those languages is a direct and necessary counter to that project, a refusal to accept the terms of the colonial project even in retrospect. The art of the Southwest is another dimension of this history that gets reduced in standard accounts to either anthropological specimen or tourist commodity. The pottery of the Pueblo communities, the weaving of the Navajo, the basketry of the Apache, the painting of the Hopi ceremonial artists, these are not craft traditions in the minor sense that the word craft sometimes implies. They are major art traditions, with as long and as sophisticated a history as any comparable tradition in the world, and they are continuing traditions, actively practiced and developed by living artists who are both maintaining inherited knowledge and making original contributions to the tradition. The Pueblo pottery revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, associated with potters like Maria Martinez of San Ildefonso, Pueblo, and Nampeo of Hopi, is one of the extraordinary stories of cultural resilience in American art history. Maria Martinez, working with her husband Julian, rediscovered and perfected the technique of producing the distinctive black-on-black San Ildefonso pottery, a technique that had been abandoned and that she reconstructed from fragmentary archaeological evidence and from her own experimental genius. Her work brought San Ildefonso pottery from obscurity to international recognition, and in doing so created an economic foundation for her community and for the broader Pueblo pottery tradition. What rarely gets told in the accounts of the Pueblo pottery revival is that Maria Martinez was doing something more than reviving a craft. She was asserting, through the creation of high-quality traditional art, that the Pueblo tradition was alive and worthy of the kind of serious engagement that American society reserved for European art. She was making an argument, through pottery, that the standard account's implicit claim that indigenous culture was a thing of the past was wrong, and she was doing it at a time when the federal government was still running boarding schools, still suppressing ceremony, still doing everything in its power to produce precisely the outcome that her work was refusing. The contemporary art produced by indigenous artists in the Southwest continues this argument. The painting of Fritz Scholder, the sculpture of Alan Hauser, the photography of Julia Tzinnar Ginny, the works of Nora Naranjo Morse and Diego Romero and Virgil Ortiz, and 100 other contemporary Pueblo and Navajo and Apache artists. These are not folk art or tourist art or ethnographic specimen. They are major contributions to the broader project of American art, made by people who bring to that project a historical depth and a cultural specificity and a technical sophistication that reflects the full complexity of the traditions they are working in and from. The fact that this art is not better known outside the Southwest and the Indian art market is itself a form of the same marginalization that produces the textbook version of Southwestern history. The assumption that indigenous art belongs in a special category separate from American art in general, that it requires a different kind of attention and a different set of credentials to appreciate, is an assumption that has served to keep indigenous artists in a separate market and separate critical discourse from the mainstream of American art, which has not been good for the artists or for the broader conversation about what American art is and where it comes from. The written literature produced by indigenous writers from the Southwest is another area of genuine achievement that remains largely outside the attention of people who encounter the standard version of the region's cultural life. Leslie Marmon Silko, from Laguna Pueblo, is one of the great American novelists of the 20th century, and her work, particularly her novel Ceremony and her later novel Almanac of the Dead, engages directly with the history we have been discussing throughout this account. Ceremony deals with the experience of a Laguna Pueblo veteran of World War II returning home to a community and a landscape damaged by the accumulation of colonial history, and with the process of healing that requires reconnecting to the indigenous ceremonial and ecological knowledge that the standard account has declared irrelevant. The stars are the same stars that ancestral Puebloan astronomers tracked from the great houses at Chaco Canyon. The water is the same water that the Hohokam channeled through 500 miles of desert canals. The land is the same land that has been farmed and managed and lived on and loved for 10,000 years. The people are still here. The story is still happening. The version in the textbooks was a lie.